Enchanting Melodies, HPSI, by Athas Parkar. 401. Chapter 401, Hungry for More. 10th May, 1995, Azkaban. In the tomb of its last wielder, Solomon's grimoire is hidden in Azkaban. Well, that complicated things, especially since Azkaban was barely more than rubble after Grindelwald blew it up. Then again, he'd been through worse. A portal opened on a hill, and he stepped through it alongside Voldemort. It was still weird to think of the man as an ally, even if he didn't trust him one bit. Considering the psychological profile Harry had built of the man, Lord Voldemort was an arrogant coward with delusions of grandeur, who also happens to be a compulsive liar who would betray anyone if it suited his goals. He was relatively easy to predict, despite his instability due to splitting his soul. It only required whatever action aligned with his goals and expected a betrayal at every turn. Unfortunately for Harry, he had no idea what Voldemort's goal would be. Well, it was going to be survival, but how he planned on doing that was very different. There was hiding away in the Land of Shadows until the end of the European school tournament. There was killing Neville Longbottom before the task, fulfilling the prophecy before Dumbledore could meddle with it. There was trying to find another way to become immortal. The possibilities were endless for someone as brilliant as Voldemort. Still, the red-eyed man was calmer than Harry expected. He expected some yelling and destruction at the knowledge of his recent mortality. Despite it all, the so-called Dark Lord remained calm and followed his mentor's advice of joining Harry to find Solomon's grimoire in Azkaban, which brought them to this salty hill in the middle of nowhere, staring at the sea. With a flick of his wand, Harry conjured a large boat, which he enchanted to row itself. They both entered it without speaking a word before the vessel started to move slowly. The horizon stretched out where the sky met the sea, painted in shades of deep blue and grey. Waves crashed against the rocky shore, sending salty mist into the air while the water shimmered under the fading light. Dark clouds hovered above, occasionally lit up by flashes of lightning. Finally, Voldemort spoke up. "You couldn't have made the portal inside the fortress." Harry shook his head. "I tried, and it kept collapsing on itself. There's something weird happening there. It seems like this won't be as easy as we expected. Is it possible that there is some remnant from the magical negation of the prison?" "I don't think so. This place used to be a magical void because the ley lines were blocked from going anywhere near the island. Grindelwald blew it up by unblocking it and letting magic flow through it. I still don't know why he did that. It could be something to do with his elaborate ritual, a way to fuck with Dumbledore and to make him lose his position in Britain and join his insane crusade. It could also be a way to weaken Britain by ending a lot of family lines that were imprisoned in Azkaban. Your followers, for example, could have been a sizable threat if you freed them and gave them time to recover. Then again, the guy is a seer and might have seen something that pushed him to do this." Voldemort rolled his eyes. "That's a very fancy way to say that you don't know." "At least I'm trying to come up with theories," Harry bit out, "but that doesn't change the fact that this place feels very weird." He wasn't lying. The more they came closer to the island, the weirder things got. Things got quieter. There were no signs of life anywhere, and the winds picked up, like a storm localized to just Azkaban. Even when he used his arcane hearing, Harry had no idea what he was hearing. The familiar music of ambient magic was slowly getting fainter, and regular pulses, akin to a heartbeat, kept getting louder as they approached the island. No one had bothered going to Azkaban since its destruction. There was no reason to. It was just a barren land with no real benefits. The Dementors had moved on to Tartarus, and the prisoners were relocated. There was no reason for anyone to come to this cursed land, so no one knew of whatever was brewing there. The last Potter's thoughts were interrupted by a large roar as a gigantic black whale, almost as large as a castle, tried to swallow their boat whole. Both Harry and Voldemort repelled it with banishing charms. As it came once more, Harry slowed down its time, and Voldemort hit it with a killing curse, which the whale shrugged off. The heir of Slytherin stared at his wand, as if not believing what he was seeing, before Harry cast his modified Patronus chains, which bound the creature and conjured a gigantic white sword that impaled it. The creature struggled for a few seconds before finally dying. Voldemort muttered, "It didn't die. What manner of creature is this?" Harry shook his head. "It didn't have any magic. It reminded me of Dementors. We need to be careful. Obviously, this place isn't as deserted as we assumed it would be." The most disturbing thing was how this thing managed to sneak through his arcane hearing. He had assumed it was merging with the environment's energy somehow, but there was still no trace of magic after he killed it. As if mocking him even further, the gigantic creature started to fade away into black mist. He had cast his variations of the Patronus charm on his own. He had created it because of his general dislike of the charm. It was highly based on an emotional component, specifically happiness, hope, and joy, which makes it a very unreliable spell unless the person mastered his emotions or hypnotized himself to feel it at will. The effect of the spells and their general strength was very hard to estimate because of the emotional component, and these sorts of spells were ones that arithmancers and researchers really disliked. It took a while to analyze how the spell manifested itself, and Harry was able to craft a lesser imitation of the spell to help against Dementors. To be completely fair, Harry had stopped working on the project over a year prior, mostly because he got bored. Still, it paid off. He had a bit of a hunch that whatever energy the gigantic whale was made of had to be similar to Dementors. It worked well enough, but this raised a lot more questions than it answered. Voldemort seemed almost as lost in thought as he stared at the ruins that used to be Europe's cruelest prison. The once formidable stone walls were now cracked and overgrown with creeping ivy, giving the place a hauntingly abandoned look. Broken towers stood silhouetted against the twilight sky. But what caught both of their interest were the gigantic black birds, similar to the mutated whale they fought, flying around the ruins. The heir of Slytherin muttered, "What happened? I have never seen anything like this before." Harry was as bewildered as the Dark Lord. "I think that there's a very good reason why the ley lines were blocked from reaching Azkaban. And it was obviously not meant to stop mages from using magic. Did Vlad tell you anything more about what Ekrizdis was up to when he made this place?" Number I didn't think to ask. I thought that this would be an easy enough task, although I do remember reading somewhere that Ekrizdis died trying to cast the Patronus charm of all things. That didn't make any sense. The arithmancy behind the Patronus charm was relatively well known. It was a spell powered by happiness with a smidge of soul magic being manifested. There was no reason why anyone, even with a broken soul, would die casting it. The spell would just fail, but nothing more than that. Something wasn't adding up. Finally, they reached the island, and Harry conjured a platform to take them there. Immediately, everything in their vicinity started to attack them at once. Harry was able to conjure weaponry to kill the facsimile of black rodents and animals trying to kill them on sight. Voldemort was particularly useless on that front. He probably couldn't cast a Patronus charm, and the creatures seemed to be very resistant to magic. The only way he helped was by transfiguring their surroundings to physically stop the creatures to give Harry some breathing room. The Parselmouth was obviously shaken by the uselessness of his presence. Harry couldn't exactly disagree with that. With the last creature dead, the so-called Dark Lord spoke up. "Something isn't right. What's happening here?" Harry finally had a small answer. "These creatures aren't alive, not really. Nothing can live here, not anymore. They're imitations of life, probably due to the concentration of whatever weird energy is being propagated on the island. The world remembers, and the energy is using that to shape itself." The moment he stepped onto the island, he had felt it. It didn't feel corrosive, not really, just strangely chaotic. It was really hard to pinpoint with his arcane hearing. It felt more like hundreds of completely different sounds at once, but he could track it down. "How did you kill them?" the Dark Lord asked. "A variation of the Patronus charm. I just took a chance, to be honest, and they seemed to be vulnerable to it for some reason. Like I said, these creatures aren't alive. Something is giving them substance, a source of the energy they're made of." He walked forward towards the source of whatever was going on, only to freeze. He could feel space and time being warped unpredictably as he got closer. Voldemort was behind him and asked, "Why did you stop?" However, Harry didn't answer. This explained a lot about why he couldn't open a portal there. Everything was in a constant state of flux. He slowly walked forward, stepping on the ruins as he approached the center of the island. As they got closer, the rubble was smaller, and there were pulses in space and time. Before long, Voldemort grabbed him by the shoulder and asked, "What are you doing, Potter?" "There's something there, something that's definitely not supposed to be here. It's like a parasite. It kills everything around it and corrupts everything with this weird energy to protect it. It's infecting the ley lines, trying to spread around like a disease." Before he could finish speaking, a gigantic bear appeared out of nowhere, trying to kill them. Harry conjured a Patronus spear, skewering it, making it dissipate into black mist. A pack of gigantic lions and wolves appeared from the shadows, trying to attack them as well. Harry conjured hundreds of chains, binding them before conjuring small spears, killing them one by one. Voldemort cast a weird black spell at a couple of bears that probably thought that they could sneak it, which also killed them immediately. What was that? "You're not the only one who experimented with variations of the Patronus charm. Did you seriously think I'd have made myself vulnerable to Dementors?" Well, there was a reason why Voldemort was known as a magical genius. Harry was tempted to ask the man more about the spell, but curbed his curiosity. They would have time to do that later. At least the man wouldn't be useless in their fight. With a nod, they walked forward. Harry felt space being warped in front of him, trying to trap him by stretching space in front of him, making him walk infinitely forward. Unfortunately for it, Harry had learned this trick years prior and negated the space manipulation. As if entranced, Harry kept killing one attacker after another, each stronger and bigger than the previous one, with Voldemort taking care of whatever stragglers they faced. That spell of his must have been pretty draining since he used it strategically. Still, whatever was doing this was obviously sentient enough to send the beasts to protect it. He stopped as he reached his destination, a pool of black tar that kept pulsing. It was completely surrounded by the chaotic energy that the creatures were made of. He couldn't help but whisper to himself, "What are you?" Voldemort behind him looked just as concerned. "Has this always been here?" "I think so. I think that Azkaban was built to stop this thing from spreading." "We can deal with that later. For now, we need to find the grimoire. That's what we're here for." As if it were listening to them, the pool of black tar released a gigantic pulse of energy, far more than it had ever done before. Harry could feel space being warped, allowing thousands of black creatures to surround them. So it could understand them too. Things got a lot more interesting. Voldemort raised his wand, but Harry stopped him. Instead of attacking, he closed his eyes and thought of Daphne, specifically his reunion after he had been stranded in another universe. This was, without a doubt, his happiest memory. He pictured it in his mind, the way she looked, the way she smelled, kissing her, and murmured, "Expecto Patronum." A glowing dove appeared out of his wand and created a gigantic pulse of white energy which vaporized every single creature surrounding him. It was overwhelming, and he now understood why what he was doing before could barely be called a Patronus charm. This was the first time he had ever cast the spell properly, and the sheer difference was mind-blowing. The dove flew around him protectively, and Harry couldn't help but smile. For some reason, it reminded him of Daphne. He looked around, making sure that they were safe before turning towards the pool of black tar. He froze when he realized that the black tar had disappeared and revealed what was beneath the whole time. It was definitely a breach in space-time, but it was what Harry could hear with his arcane hearing that made him freeze. Hunger, pure hunger. That was what was on the other side, and it had set its eyes on Harry. It was familiar. For some reason, Harry felt like he could recognize it, before realized where he had felt it before. The Dementors. They were essentially animated portals, and this was very similar to what was on the other side. He remembered the hunger, the void that wanted to swallow everything. After all, he had closed one of the portals before. He felt the pool expand, try to absorb him, and felt space warp to push him in. But he released a pulse of space of his own, pushing himself to the other side, and did his best to close the breach. However, it was far larger and far more stable than the Dementors. He just couldn't do it. Seeing that he had no other choice, he ran out, grabbing a surprised Voldemort with him. They needed to get the hell out of this island. Harry was a capable wizard, an understatement to say the least, but he had no clue how to fight a fucking eldritch being without proper research or preparation. He ran forward, trying to do his best to negate the warps in space and time. They reached the sea, only to realize that the entire place was filled with the familiar black tar that had protected the space-time breach. Yeah, he wasn't touching that with a 10-foot pole. So flying was his best bet then. He was tempted to transform into a raven and fly away, but it was too risky. He couldn't use magic in his animagus form, and he couldn't exactly risk being attacked by the army of giant black birds and falling into the pool. That sounded like a very bad idea all around. Also, he wouldn't be able to protect Voldemort. Maybe he could kill him and run away. It was better than risking him being corrupted by whatever this was and would mess with Dumbledore's plans. He wasn't particularly attacked by the monster after all. Oddly enough, while trying to figure out what he had at his disposal, Harry found the answer to his question. There was a weird cavern at the edge of the island where he could feel genuine structure magic being used instead of the corrupted mess. Something was protecting it, some type of ward probably geared to protect against what was happening. Even if this was temporary, Harry could study the ward scheme easily enough and replicate it so that they could escape. Yeah, that was the best plan he could come up with. Harry turned towards the terrified heir of Slytherin and yelled, "Follow me!" They ran towards the specific cave and entered the cave. Harry felt the pool of black tar turn into a wave and tried to reach them, only to be stopped by a golden shield. Harry slumped slightly while murmuring, "Well, at least this can buy us some time." "Some time?" Voldemort spoke up with an incredulous yet terrified tone. "I need an explanation on what's happening, Potter." "Hey, I don't know a lot more than you about what's going on. Believe me, I'd rather not be here either." Harry turned to explore the cave a bit and saw a familiar name written in Middle English, Ecrisdis. He turned towards his companion with a slight smirk. "Well, we did end up finding his tomb." "Huh. 402. Chapter 402, Wisdom's Path. 10th May 1995, Azkaban. Harry turned to explore the cave a bit and saw a familiar name written in Middle English, Ecrisdis. He turned towards his companion with a slight smirk. "Well, we did end up finding his tomb." "Huh." The name was carved on one of the walls. It was precise enough to have been obviously made using magic, especially considering how it held up to the tests of time. Harry slowly traced it with his fingers, trying to decipher the obvious magical remnants that such an act of magic would have released, only for his arcane hearing to be completely silent. The only thing that he could make out was that peculiar ward scheme, and even then he could barely understand glimpses of it, as if he was hearing a single instrument instead of a whole orchestra. He would need to decipher it on his way out, hopefully to adapt it in a way to stop whatever corruption the breach was releasing from spreading. Still, now that they were safe and had actually found Ecrisdis' tomb, they might as well also take what they were coming from. It was extremely weird, trying to solve magic without his arcane hearing. It had been part of his life for so long that it felt like he was missing a limb. Harry slowly traced the carved name once more, and Voldemort growled, "We need to get out of here. We came here for Solomon's grimoire, and I'm not leaving without it. You're perfectly welcome to just leave, but that's on you." "I would if you'd just make us a portal," the heir of Slytherin retorted. Harry groaned. "Were we in the same place? Did you not see the distortions in space-time? We'd have better luck trying to kill a dragon with stinging hexes than hope to survive any form of space warping." "So we're stuck here," the so-called Dark Lord complained. "Look, you could stay here and whine while trying to understand a barrier whose magic I genuinely don't understand. Or you could join me and try to find Solomon's grimoire. Whoever made this place obviously knew about whatever was going on above and made sure that this place was not to be breached." Voldemort looked at him like he was crazy. "Follow you where? I must have vastly overestimated your capabilities since this a dead end." Harry smirked before channeling a bit of magic into Ecrisdis' carved name. The name slowly released a faint golden glow before letting the cavern wall morph like a liquid, revealing a hidden passageway. The so-called Dark Lord gave Harry a stupefied look. "How did you find it?" "I tried every revealing charm when we came here and found nothing." Harry grinned. No one would ever go through the trouble of protecting a random cavern with some very impressive magic for no reason. The young wizard didn't mention the fact that he ended up using a little trick to narrow things down quickly. After all, someone purposefully made sure that any trace of magic was hidden, but the magic was still there, just hidden. Harry just released his own magic, but also made sure he was connected to it. It was an ancient and very inefficient method of magical sensing. All it did was see if an artifact would react to magic in some way. When Harry felt small amounts of magic disappear from his senses, it had to be absorbed somehow, which is why he found the entrance so quickly. Still, it was a very interesting trap, all things considered. Wizards and witches would easily find themselves a bit lost without the obvious revealing spells. Even someone of Voldemort's caliber had given up after trying out his vast array of detection spells. Voldemort raised an impressed eyebrow at Harry and spoke up. "Well, you've led us here so far." Harry grinned and walked through the entrance. On the other side seemed to be some kind of magical laboratory. He could see liquids that had lost their magic through time, more than a few dissected magical creatures and small rune sequences, probably for a ritual. He ignored the small cell with the decomposed yet very human bodies that Ecrisdis was obviously experimenting on. It was pretty disturbing. The smell alone was horrible, let alone how everything just felt wrong. Whatever protection against magical sensing must have been only bound to the previous, so Harry could hear the sheer wrongness of everything around him. It was like a nail on a chalkboard, which was again very oddly contrasted by the fact that Harry knew that he barely detected a fraction of what was truly happening. Even if they were trapped by an eldritch being, he couldn't help but feel slightly curious by a type of magic that he simply couldn't replicate in seconds. It wasn't that his arcane hearing couldn't pick it out, but was mostly like Harry himself just couldn't interpret it properly. Voldemort murmured, looking disturbingly fascinated by what he was seeing. "Ecrisdis's laboratory. I remember reading that they couldn't find it after he died. I thought he destroyed it or something, but to have left it here, in plain sight." Harry's tone was very strict this time. Whatever was studied here must be left alone. "We're hunting down one of the most powerful sources of magical knowledge in history, and you're wary of me misusing this. You certainly have a strange sense of priorities. Solomon's grimoire is the key to ridding the world of the influence of the light and dark, not some tool for you to try to conquer the world." Voldemort chuckled in response. It had to be one of the worst sounds Harry had ever heard. Still, there was something that he was missing. He could feel it as if it was in the corner of his eye. Ecrisdis wouldn't have put his name on his workshop, would he? No, from all accounts, he was an ideal mage. He was secretive and powerful, and had no compunction to ignore morality for his progress. The protections would have been far stronger, especially since the outer wards held for so long. This was a diversion, a way to deter people or perhaps test them. The realization hit Harry as he saw what was on one of his tables. It had been niggling in the back of his head, like this small detail that felt wrong in what he was seeing. He knew that there had to be something. He noticed a rune matrix carved on one of the tables, which was completely unlike the rest of the room. It was completely wrong, for one, and from what Harry could gather, its purpose was very different from everything else in the room, which was pretty horrifying. Harry ignored Voldemort gawking at the notes of the experiments, trying to understand the research. Instead, he focused on this table. There were runes that he wasn't familiar with. He had learned a lot of runic languages, but there theoretically could be an infinite number of languages out there. But there were enough Sumerian runes for him to have a basic understanding of what its purpose was. Protection, binding, humanity, spirit, that was what he could make up from the matrix. It was unlike someone like Ecrisdis to try to figure out something like this. However, the matrix itself was unbalanced. It was subtle, but there was an absorption rune that risked overloading the entire thing if it was powered. He probably shouldn't have done that, but Harry fixed it, if by reflex more than anything. He didn't even power it, but the runes glowed golden, and a door opened on the other side of the room. He stiffened, and so did Voldemort. "How did you do that?" "I think I solved a puzzle," Harry retorted, feeling slightly lost. This didn't seem like the appropriate protection for a workshop. Slowly but surely, they walked through the new corridor, only to be attacked by a large legion of undead. Harry was about to start destroying them, only for Voldemort to raise his hand and release a pulse of black magic that made them all fall, whatever magic that animated them disappearing. Harry gave him a questioning look, only for the Dark Lord to respond with a haughty tone. Necromancy was always a fascination of mine. Well, it made sense that the guy who wanted to cheat death would learn as much as he could about necromancy. He wasn't exactly surprised, given that Voldemort was known to user inferi during his campaign against Dumbledore. Not that these were inferior. Harry could tell that the magic was very different, especially given the way the Resurrection Stone had been pulsing slightly when they arrived. At least Voldemort saved him the trouble of trying to figure out how to deactivate them. They walked forward until finding themselves in a very dusty room with a pedestal on it. On it, a skeleton remained, obviously dead, but was clutching in his hands a very large golden tome. There were no doubts about what it was. It was the same unnatural magic he had felt in the entrance, the one that he could partially perceive but not truly understand. Harry walked cautiously, expecting another trap, and hesitatingly touched the book. A pulse of golden light illuminated the room, cleaning up the centuries of dust and grime and allowing the skeleton to dissolve into dust. Voldemort took it from him and slowly opened it, only to find empty pages. "What is this? We came all this way for an empty book." The last Potter spoke up. "Let me see." Harry grabbed the tome from the Dark Lord, hoping that it would have a different reaction somehow. He had been hoping that the grimoire had imprinted itself on his magic somehow, allowing him only to read it. It had been why he had done his best to touch the book first, and yet the pages remained blank. Harry was trying to figure out if there was another puzzle or something, only for a foreign voice to speak up behind them. "Don't bother, there are no secrets in here. Not anymore." Both Voldemort and Harry turned towards the source of the noise, their wands raised and froze as they saw a man with very long white hair that was braided to his waist. He was dark-skinned, with golden eyes, and was wearing some very old yet luxurious robes. The heir of Slytherin must have come up to the same conclusion as Harry, because he asked, "Solomon?" "Not quite. Yes and no. I am what remains of Solomon, his last legacy. But that doesn't matter. You're late. We're almost out of time. Maybe we already are." "You're the grimoire," Harry spoke up, realizing what he was seeing. "You're the piece of Solomon he put inside it. You're like a living, breathing family crest." The white-haired man grinned proudly. "A nice theory, but an incorrect one. I'm the safeguard Solomon created when crafted the grimoire, a portion of his desires that grew over time. Still, you're a clever one, aren't you? You must be if you passed my little tests. I never thought I'd have to wait so long for someone to come here. They were supposed to be pretty easy, all things considered. I wonder what happened in the quality of mages when I was gone." Voldemort seethed in anger. "Is that what those were? Some stupid tests to amuse yourself?" As if completely contrasted, the grin on Solomon's face disappeared. "You have no idea how little amusement I find in the situation we are in. Especially since I will have to rely on an abomination with a broken soul like you. Unfortunately, I don't really have the luxury of choice." Harry asked before Voldemort could speak up and made things even worse, "Why do you need help?" The previous wielder of the grimoire foolishly used its knowledge to summon something he shouldn't have. "You're talking about the dimensional breach in the middle of the island. It was covered with black stuff." The white-haired man nodded. "That's correct. You really shouldn't have aggravated it by destroying its manifestations. The black stuff, as you call it, is a very chaotic form of energy, a way to hide what it was from detection from the rest of the world. It's designed to mimic, even if it's quite bad, any form of energy or life in a place, act as the agent of the entity in the material realm. It slowly infects anything it touches to make copies or replacements, as everything is being devoured slowly. It spreads through magic, ley lines, ambient magic, anything it could have access to. Which is why the ley lines were blocked, stopping any form of magic from spreading. But why would anyone do this? It was a mistake. Ikrizdis wished to create weapons that would have killed light and dark champions. It was a very foolish concept. which caused him to sink deeper and deeper into madness. Perhaps his last act was a noble one, but the suffering he caused, let us not speak of it any more. Harry, though, decided to ask a question that's been on his mind for a while. So, what exactly is this entity? I know what I felt, what I saw on the other side. The hunger. This is an eldritch being. There's very little we can do against something like this, especially while we're trapped in this place without any sort of support or preparation. The hunger. That's quite an apt description. It's known as the Devourer of Worlds, or Nidhogg. With magic roaming once more in this place, its corruption has been spreading without anything stopping it. In exchange for your help, I'm prepared to teach you my creator's magic. That should be enough to balance the scales, don't you think? The power-hungry smile on Voldemort's face did not reassure Harry, not at all. There was something very wrong going on, and the young wizard was definitely not going to trust some projection without any form of assurances. He looked the projection straight in the eyes and spoke up. Tell me everything you know about this Nidhogg. Then we'll talk about whether or not we'll help. 403, Chapter 403, Wisdom's Path. 10th May 1995, Azkaban. There was something very wrong going on, and the young wizard was definitely not going to trust some projection without any form of assurances. He looked the projection straight in the eyes and spoke up. Tell me everything you know about this Nidhogg. Then we'll talk about whether or not we'll help. Nidhogg, the serpent of the end, the dragon who gnaws at the roots of the world tree, Yggdrasil. First Ragnarök and now this. It was very odd how it all came around to Norse mythology all the time. Solomon's face fell for a fraction of a second when Harry didn't immediately agree to follow his lead. It was almost imperceptible, but the young wizard was actively looking for it. An easy way to see past a disguise is to make people irritated, and prideful people are so easy to be irritated. The former king's eyes obviously narrowed at the disrespect, at not being taken at his word immediately. Then again, kings were used to being immediately obeyed without question. He has probably never been refused once in his life. Of course, the white-haired man, a former king, perked up instantly and spoke up. Every culture across the multiverse has a very fundamental concept that is the end of times. It's logical, really, that everything that had a beginning must have an end. But realms themselves suffer from the same thing. Realms are born from the chaos between worlds, when by pure coincidence a form of order, a concept perhaps, gains enough energy to shield itself from everything around it. And since realms are born, realms must also die. Death comes in many forms. The most common problem for young realms is running out of energy and succumbing back into the chaos from which it was born. However, old realms are far more resilient, and even as they expand enough that the concentration of energy is so low that whatever purpose it holds is gone, it's still taking up place. Chaos found a solution to that, a culling, so to speak. Nidhogg, Harry muttered. Exactly. It's a predator realm, capable of infecting other realms, creating small tears before absorbing its energy and recycling it back into the void. It will never be full, never stop devouring realms until all realms are nothing but chaos. Can we negotiate with it, or try to convince it that our world shouldn't be devoured some other way? Voldemort asked, while obviously calming himself. I don't think you quite understand what we're facing. This isn't a human being, it's a concept that was so powerful that it formed its own realm and gained consciousness. It's pure hunger, and we're the food. It doesn't understand right and wrong, peace and war, light and dark. All it understands is its hunger. It wasn't really supposed to affect the material realm, not until the heat death of the universe, but Echrizdis, in his hubris, invited it in and made a connection to it, hoping to use it as a weapon against the light and dark. He did not think that he could defeat their champions, so he built creatures, avatars of Nidhogg, to suck the champion's energy. He had hoped that by offering traces of the light and dark to Nidhogg, it would act as a beacon, turning them into targets. Of course, he failed. He never considered the idea that all this did was attract its attention further to the material realm. He never expected the avatars to slowly be consumed by the realm. He never expected that the creature would be intelligent enough to open a breach here. He sacrificed his life, sealing any ambient magic from reaching the island. People turned this place into a prison of all things, and then some idiot allowed magic to flow back in, and now you can see the result. To be completely fair, Harry could have never guessed this to be the Dementor's origins, and a part of him really wasn't convinced. Sure, he could see someone being desperate enough to do something like this. It was a pretty ingenious idea to use an outsider predator against two essentially living realms. However, there was no guarantee that Nidhogg would target the light and dark, or that it would even work. There was a lot that Harry didn't know about how dimensions behaved, and this was proof of it. And even if it could work, even if it was a viable plan, then that also didn't explain the Dementor's behavior after Ecrizdis's death. If they really were the avatars of an eldritch being, like Solomon said, then why would they just obey wizards and witches and act as fancy guards in a prison for centuries? They would have been trying to unseal whatever Ecrizdis had done to block the ley lines, doing their best to let their patron return. Something definitely wasn't adding up, and Harry decided to push a bit. And where were you? Why didn't you stop Ecrizdis if what he was doing was so fundamentally stupid? I'm not the Grimoire Potter, the projection spoke up. I'm a safety guard. I wasn't activated until after Ecrizdis created the breach. Yes, the young wizard was confident that the projection wasn't being completely truthful, and whatever it wasn't sharing was unlikely to share it later. Harry wasn't planning on doing anything drastic without some proper reassurance. He didn't want to deal with another diary situation, this time with the grimoire of the greatest mage to ever exist. Voldemort spoke up once more. And do you have a plan, now that the breach is almost free? The projection immediately perked up. The main priority is to stop Nidhogg's influence from spreading. We can purify and try to contain the breach afterwards, but as long as we contain the threat, I'll be satisfied. Isn't that just a temporary measure at best? Nidhogg will remain a threat either way, the young wizard protested, and didn't sealing the ley lines kill Ecrizdis? Who said anything about sealing ley lines? It took me centuries, but I was able to find a way to upscale the golden shield that protects this place into something sustainable in the long run. It's just a normal ward, but one that needs someone capable of casting. Harry gave him a dubious look. I don't know about Voldemort, but I could barely make out a fraction of the shield, and believe me, I'm very good at analyzing magic. The projection's grin turned slightly smug. I did tell you that I'd teach you Solomon's magic. The truth about my creator is that he wasn't a very powerful mage, at least in terms of raw power, but he was a genius. He made a very impressive discovery. The way people used magic was one-dimensional. People assumed that magic was just energy and manipulated it into crafting spells and thought that this was it, but the truth is that magic is layered. What we see and what we experience as living beings is just the surface. There are a lot of causes and effects that are hidden when that happens, which aren't actually being properly manipulated. It took some time, but my creator was able to find a way to manipulate it, to craft spells that would only cost him a fraction of the magic that it did other mages. He elevated the craft by even adding elements of the magic that no one could break, no one could truly comprehend. It was so alien that even the light and dark couldn't protect themselves against it. And on the shoulders of that single discovery, he built a kingdom that the world had never seen the like again. Voldemort seemed doubtful. Then why were none of the other grimoire holders able to do the same? No one was able to seal the light and dark as Solomon did. No one was able to create wonders, to reshape the world like Solomon did, especially if all he did was figure out a way to cast magic differently. The white-haired man seemed almost insulted. All he did was figure out a way to cast magic differently. Solomon was a genius who was clever enough to bind forces of nature, of immeasurably figuring out the weaknesses in anything and exploiting them like a scalpel. What the grimoire holds is not the sum of his knowledge. It's barely more than the scribbles he made when he was bored. This man could reshape dimensions, bind gods, and destroy demons with barely any preparation. If he had been inclined to, he could have ascended to the ranks of the gods themselves, become an immortal ruler, joining the ranks of the Olympians, and perhaps even surpassing them. You could spend decades studying a single spell and still not have a quarter of his insight when he crafted it on a whim in minutes. No one had seen anything like it before or since. Perhaps no one will do it again. To be honest, Harry did have to agree with the projection's point. Truly understanding magic could be very overpowered. Objectively, his arcane hearing alone had made him one of the most terrifying mages in recent history, and he wasn't even 15 yet. Sure, he was intelligent, but he had no delusion that he would have come this far without this skill. But as useful as a new form of magic was, this was all sort of useless. Harry didn't really have the time to master an entirely new form of magic in a month. What he came here for was a way to finally put an end to Dumbledore and Grindelwald. Nothing more. He had no intention of being involved in another mess with another dimensional clusterfuck. Yes, the safest bet was for them to regroup. Maybe ask Vlad for advice and then decide whether the grimoire was worth dealing with a fucking eldritch entity. Perhaps the vampire would have more clues or help them avoid the subject, or maybe he could have known something to solve this entire thing altogether. They weren't exactly in a hurry to make a choice, which was why Harry spoke up. Your offer is exciting, but do you mind giving us more time to make a decision? You see, we're sort of trapped here, and we're not exactly prepared to perform mass rituals or anything of the like. The projection narrowed its eyes at Harry. You're willing to risk the world being consumed by Nidhogg. Azkaban was destroyed a year ago, and the corruption didn't make it past the island. We can afford a few days to prepare and put our affairs in order. You are not prisoners here. You can leave if you want to, but the grimoire must remain here. I am bound to this place and will not leave as long as the breach remains open. However, I cannot see a way where you'd be able to escape intact. You will be swarmed by Nidhogg's creatures as soon as you step out of the barrier. I'm afraid that I will not be able to help you, not without teaching you the magic held within the grimoire. Solomon's projection was definitely trying to push them into a corner. Harry had no idea what it wanted, but he could tell that it wouldn't be good for them, and unfortunately, they were in a bit of a pickle. He and Voldemort had come to the tomb hoping to find the grimoire, and if that failed, Harry would have done his best to copy the ward on the entrance, or at least try to adapt it in some way to help them escape. If the projection was telling the truth, then he was missing a vital piece to be able to replicate the feat, so that was a lost cause. That didn't mean that escape was impossible. He could combine some enchantments with his animagus form, a way to accelerate flight perhaps, or an enchantment to slow his perception of time. He couldn't cast any magic while in flight, but enchanted items could still work. He could start by clearing things up a bit with a Patronus charm and escape as quickly as he could while there were as few of those black creatures roaming around as possible. He's fought worse odds before. There was another option, the invisibility cloak. How did he not think of it before? He had some luck merging it with his animagus form. That would be an easy way to remain undetected while flying away. In fact, it was pretty likely to succeed. So yes, he had options, but the bigger problem was Voldemort. All of Harry's escape plans were due to magic that only he could cast. He had no clue how the so-called Dark Lord would fare. They hadn't exactly fought together and had both kept a lot of capabilities secret from one another in case they needed to fight once more. He didn't doubt that the man hadn't been planning some sort of escape. Speaking of Voldemort, he also looked angry. He probably didn't like the projection's obvious attempt at screwing them over in some way. Or maybe he just didn't like Harry taking control of the conversation and deciding their next move. Who could tell with this guy? He was as unstable as they came. As the young wizard walked out of the room in silence, the Parselmouth walked furiously behind him and hissed, "Explain yourself, Potter. We need to get out of here. Do you have any plans of escape?" Escape? We found what we came for. We can use the grimoire, cast a single ward, and leave this cursed island without looking back. What I don't understand is why you seem so reluctant to take what we came here for. That brought Harry short, and he gave the Dark Lord an incredulous look. You seriously don't see it? Please tell me you're joking or something. This is not the time for jokes, Potter. The projection, the young wizard spoke slowly, deciding to voice his thoughts. It's definitely not some innocent grimoire that wants to save the world. It has an ulterior motive, one that obviously involves us. Probably not in a good way. This cavern is obviously some form of trap, and we need to get out of here. Voldemort sneered at him. Your hesitation is proof of your weakness, boy. I understand hesitating before greatness, but all we have to do is cast a ward around the island, and in exchange, we're learning a new form of magic. How is this in any way duplicitous? I don't know, Harry admitted, but that doesn't mean there isn't something wrong. You can't tell me that this doesn't feel weird to you. Being close doesn't mean that we can afford to be careless. So please, for once, can you please trust me? We can come back later after a proper conversation away from this place and take him up on his deal. We don't have to do this now, Riddle. He saw a complicated look on Voldemort's face. It had been there for barely more than a fraction of a second before disappearing. I will follow your lead on this, Potter. You've brought us this far. Harry slagged in relief. They were near the entrance of the cavern, and he answered softly, I'm sorry about being too stubborn about this. It's just that something doesn't feel right. He didn't hear Voldemort's answer because he felt something push him out of the cavern towards the Black Sea. As quickly as he could, he thought of Daphne and cast Expecto Patronum. In a white pulse of light, the sea around him turned to normal once more for a fraction of a second before trying to attack him once more. However, this was enough time for Harry to turn into his animagus form and fly back to the cavern. He made it just in time as the black tar that made up the sea around Azkaban tried to viciously penetrate the golden shield. He turned towards where Voldemort used to be, only to find the cavern to be completely empty. Damn it, Riddle! He had been so lost in his own head, in possibilities and plans, that he hadn't noticed Voldemort subtly leading him outward, into the place where his arcane hearing didn't work. The Dark Lord must have noticed that Harry was sensitive to magic and tried to use that against him. At least it wasn't a killing curse. He did deserve it for showing his back, Voldemort of all people. He was so used to his arcane hearing warning him of incoming spells that he thought he was safe. He also shouldn't have assumed that Voldemort would be more sensible, even if the man probably didn't want to kill him. As he ran back to Ecrisdis' tomb, he remembered the look on Voldemort's face a few seconds prior. He recognized it now. It was complete desperation. It was a complete contrast to the power-hungry look he had before. This was never about power, was it? This was never about becoming strong. No, Voldemort was afraid. He was always a coward, but the destruction of his Horcruxes must have shaken him. Harry hadn't really realized how much. He definitely wasn't thinking straight, and that made him very dangerous. He wanted a new way to beat death, a new way to be immortal. Harry suddenly realized that the projection had said something about ascending into godhood. It was playing Voldemort like a fiddle. How could he have missed something like that? Harry was never the target, Voldemort was. He had thought that the projection was aiming to convince him to agree, that it wanted him. But he was wrong, wasn't he? It knew Voldemort's weakness and used that against him. He needed to stop Voldemort from doing anything reckless. He ran to the entrance and paled as he heard Voldemort's voice. You have an agreement. My aid in exchange for Solomon's magic. The white-haired man smiled at that. So be it. No, Harry yelled as he ran into the room, but it was for naught. The projection released a pulse of energy, and the entire world shifted. Harry could feel as if his entire brain was melting. He activated his arcane hearing to understand what was happening. He was tempted to use the cloak to phase through whatever magic was happening, only to freeze as he finally realized what the projection meant as a change in perspective. The white-haired man hadn't been joking when he meant that everyone had been taking a one-dimensional approach to magic. He could see it now, the layers, the chaos beneath every spell, and the way it was ordered in the wards around the cavern. It was a golden cage, completely built to negate any non-material form of entrance, essentially anything that wasn't born in the world. The black tar that surrounded the island wasn't really a physical thing. He understood now what it was. A physical manifestation of corruption, of energies that unraveled everything it touched, trying to turn everything into chaos, into a homogeneous mush of nothingness. He had thought that Nidhogg was a representation of hunger, but it wasn't. It enforced entropy on a cosmic scale, essentially a fancy garbage collector that took care of realms that became empty enough that it couldn't defend itself from being devoured. He could feel it now, staring at the material realm, like a serpent poised to strike at every moment, only held at bay from the protection the gods put in place around the material realm that Mordred enforced. Yet Ecrizdis was able to make a sustainable breach, something that Harry didn't even think was possible. It gave Harry so many ideas, ways to optimize spells, but most of all, ways to cast his fractal attacks, which were able to wound Dumbledore and Grindelwald without the need of using a soul as a focus. It would be tricky, but it would be doable. But that wasn't the point now. He needed to focus on the task at hand. Harry pushed his perception towards the breach and froze completely. Harry had things completely wrong. There were wards around the breach, but it wasn't there to stop it. Well, there were some safeguards to contain the breach, but there was something that literally also kept the breach open. The world wanted to breach it, but there was some magic actively making sure that it had access to Nidhogg. He turned toward the grinning white-haired man, the realization slowly settling in. "You're not Solomon, are you?" The projection faded away into modes of light, which slowly made its way towards the Ecrizdis skeleton, which had previously held the grimoire in death. Slowly but surely, flesh started to grow from its bones. It could barely even be called flesh. It was more like white mud that imitated the functionality. Slowly, a bald man with completely black eyes, which held black veins that spread all over his body, sat up from the altar and looked at them. Both Harry and Voldemort stared at the being in horror as he spoke up. "I said you were a clever one. Ecrizdis, at your service. You have no idea how glad I am that you're here." Well, shit. Why did Harry have to be right about this? Maybe there was an innocent explanation for what happened. Who was he kidding? This guy had evil written all over him. Yeah, this definitely wasn't going to end well. 404. Chapter 4. Beyond the Horizon. 10th May 1995, Azkaban. Both Harry and Voldemort stared at the being in horror as he spoke up. "I said you were a clever one. Ecrizdis, at your service. You have no idea how glad I am that you're here." Well, shit. Why did Harry have to be right about this? Maybe there was an innocent explanation for what happened. Who was he kidding? This guy had evil written all over him. Yeah, this definitely wasn't going to end well. 1,000 thoughts raced across Harry's head as he stared at the man before him. Like, why did he give them access to Solomon's magic system? Well, it was obviously intended for Voldemort, but there was no reason why Ecrizdis would use an area of effect spell to grant the insight necessary to use Solomon's magic system. And it was a magical system. It was just so different, so overpowered, that it had to be considered a system of its own. But why did Ecrizdis reveal his true identity and how much of what he said was a lie? He definitely wouldn't have revealed himself without having gotten what he wanted. The question was what the man achieved. While Harry was doing his best to analyze the situation, Voldemort became more confrontational and pointed his wand at the former Dark Lord. "Ecrizdis is dead." "Oh, am I really hurting your sensibilities, boy? Believe it or not, there are other ways to achieve immortality without ripping away at your soul as you have. Do you have any idea what awaits you when your miserable existence is gone? Nothing. You will not have the luxury of an afterlife. You will not reincarnate. You will spend an eternity in the void until your very ego, whatever consciousness you have left, succumbs to madness and fades away. And after that, the energy that makes up your soul will dissipate into nothing. That is the fate that awaits those who are foolish enough to rupture their souls." "I will not die," the heir of Slytherin growled. Ecrizdis' answer was a laugh. "Everyone dies. What is a century, 1,000 years compared to eternity? Our sun will fade, our planet will be destroyed, and the universe will eventually succumb to nothingness. Solomon's grimoire holds wonders of magic beyond anything you can imagine, but there is nothing that can stop the inevitability of death. Delay it perhaps, but never stop it. Even if you ascend to godhood, you will die. For everything that has a beginning must have an end." That last statement felt like a fundamental law of the universe, and it rang like a pulse of magic, an absolute truth of existence. The dark wizard's face softened slightly. "You will not find what you seek in the grimoire. Perhaps in time you will learn not to fear the inevitable. I sincerely hope you'll live for long enough to understand that." Harry turned towards the abomination and spoke up clearly. "Why did you do all of this? Why all the trickery?" The abomination spoke up, a smile growing on his face. Ah, the clever one. Who would have thought that the child would be the hardest to deceive? And yet, this intelligence will not be rewarded. Quite tragic, if I say so myself. The truth is that I gave you the foundation of Solomon's magic for one simple reason. Because we made a deal. And just like that, everything clicked and Harry paled. A deal. That was what this whole mess was about. Aid for Solomon's magic. His new perception of magic allowed Harry to realize that this exchange was binding, only they didn't know it was at the time. The magic was hidden through layers of Solomon's own magic. They hadn't realized that they were being bound. Harry had never agreed to a deal. He knew that for a fact. He was always careful with that. It was something that he unconsciously did the moment he knew that Fae had once roamed the earth. Still, he never expected it to be possible to be bound without even knowing it. Oaths and vows were like chains on your very beings. No one could just ignore their presence, but people got used to it over time. However, Voldemort did agree, and he was now bound to help Ecrizdis. Thankfully, Harry himself wasn't involved at all, and that made him even more wary. There was also the fact that Ecrizdis gave them only the foundation of Solomon's magic, but not the research or the knowledge. It would take centuries for them to ever catch up to someone using the grimoire. Thus, they weren't threats to him. It all reeked of manipulation, but the main question was why? Why did Ecrizdis need someone to help? He had all the knowledge of Solomon at his fingertips, everything he could ever hope for. Even if he needed some patsy, he could have just left Azkaban at any time and found a power-hungry idiot and tricked him into serving him. Unless he couldn't leave. Harry gave the man a blank look. "This is your prison." "It was," Ecrizdis replied. "When I opened the breach, I never expected to meet so much opposition. I could make a connection without too many problems, but I couldn't create an active breach. Something always closed it, some external force, or perhaps the will of the world itself. I never quite figure it out. So I resorted to desperate measures. I needed an enormous amount of energy to open a stable breach. I was desperate and alone. I shouldn't have been so hasty or arrogant, but I cannot change the past. Not anymore. I kidnapped hundreds of peasants, mostly just criminals, bandits, and people who would have been put to the sword anyway. I put them in these cells and sacrificed them all to open the breach. It was tragic, but it was necessary, or at least I thought it was. How many lives would I save by destroying the light and dark? It would have been worth it in the long run, and it worked perfectly. I sealed the ley lines to avoid any sort of contamination from the breach, and the sacrifices were more than enough to maintain the breach for a good while. All that remained was that I hunt down the champions of light and dark. They were barely in their teens, children really. I was so close. But something stopped you. I'm guessing someone didn't like what you did. One of the champion's mentors, perhaps, Harry stated. I wish it was a mage, but no, boy. What stopped me was the grimoire itself. Who would have thought that the damn book would develop a form of sentience? Who would have thought that it would object to what I was trying to achieve? I realized that it had a form of sentience when it refused to reveal more of its secrets after the massacre. But I never would have guessed that it would have been capable of casting magic. It was very subtle. I failed to notice it until it was too late. It was a very slow curse, binding my very soul to this place, forcing me to stay until the breach was closed, until my life's work was gone. It almost got what it wanted. After all, I was only a man bound to a cavern, doing his best to keep his dream alive. Even as the world itself wanted to close the breach, I refused. I wouldn't be cowed when I had sacrificed so much. He looked regretful for a fraction of a second before continuing. I had no other choice. I couldn't exactly get enough magic there without it being corrupted, and I needed energy to keep the breach open. I was running out of time, so I used my golems, my wraiths, my weapons against the light and dark, capable of absorbing life force and setting them free. I used the life force they absorbed to keep the breach open, but that energy needed someone to direct it, someone capable enough to keep the delicate balance. I needed a replacement, someone that would be bound in my place as I hunt down the light and dark. I needed someone who could understand magic enough to keep the corruption from spreading. And so, I waited for someone to find me for centuries. Until we came, Harry realized. Until you came, the man agreed. You have no idea how glad I am that you're here. You will be able to take the mantle, to keep the breach open until I fulfill my purpose. And when the light and dark finally disappear, when Nidhogg sets his eyes on them, I would close the breach and set you free once more. And so, Lord Voldemort, I have fulfilled my side of our agreement, and now it's time for you to return the favor. You can aid me by taking my place, by taking my curse, to stay here with Solomon's grimoire, maintaining the breach until the breach closes. Harry felt a pulse of magic and understood the command for what it was. It was enforcing the verbal contract that they had made. Immediately, Voldemort fell to the floor and started to writhe in obvious agony, but without a single yell of pain. The former Dark Lord spoke up gently. I truly am sorry. It hurts, but I cannot abandon my purpose. Hopefully, I will be done soon, and you'll be free once more. Harry gave Ecrisdis a pleading look. What about the consequences of the breach? What about the corrupted mess that has invaded this island? The breach is obviously not as stable as you'd have liked. Whoever released the ley lines is responsible for that, not me. If you hadn't come to free me, then it was likely that the world would have ended somewhere in the next decade. Don't worry, I will be sealing off the ley lines to stop the infection from spreading and stabilize the breach properly, before hunting down the champions properly. Or you could have closed the breach, let things go. Are you really willing to let the entire world burn for no reason? Defeating the light and dark is meaningless if there's no one left to enjoy this victory. For the first time, anger appeared on the monster's face. You expect me to throw away everything I sacrificed, everything I worked for. And for what? For some ungrateful mortals that look at me and see an abomination. Do you think I care about their pitiful little lives? No, I'm doing this for me, and me alone. Harry couldn't help but feel unsettled by the man's response. It was very ironic how similar all three of them were. Voldemort, Ecrisdis, and Harry wanted to destroy the light and dark at all costs. All of them were very powerful wielders of magic. Prodigies, even. But looking at the two other mages, Harry couldn't help but feel pity. They were so alone, so empty, so broken, and Harry could see a twisted mirror of himself in them. They were so consumed by their goal that they never really lived. Who would ever consider killing hundreds of people to be an appropriate sacrifice for anything? They reminded him of Dumbledore and Grindelwald, and that thought shook him to the core. They were all the same, weren't they? Everyone had an idea about what the world should be, and they were willing to burn the world down if it meant that they would be one step closer to making their vision a reality. Was that how they were all doomed to become, monsters who pretended that what they did was for some grand vision? Harry refused to follow that path. The young wizard had one last question on his lips. Why are you telling me any of this? You could have just left. Why bother telling us information that might harm you? His answer was a sad smile. You don't get it, do you? You will do nothing because you can do nothing. You will both be trapped here in my stead. I thought that the least I owe you is an explanation. While Harry had been speaking for so long, he'd been preparing a trap, a rune matrix, folded in non-Euclidean space, folded in a way that only his new magical insight allowed. He had thought that he had mastered space magic, but he now realized that he barely scratched the surface. It didn't technically make sense from an outsider's perspective. The runes covered the entirety of the cavern and yet could also fit in the palm of his hands. It had been tricky to deal with, but it essentially would create a subspace of infinite space around Ecrisdis. It wouldn't let him move, and yet would make him untouchable, a binding with pure space. He was pretty proud of that one. Harry gave him a doubtful look. I didn't make a deal with you. There's no reason for me to stay exactly. Not all prisons are physical, boy. I assure you that you will not leave this cavern without my agreement. I can't have you warning the light and dark of my coming, can I? Well, that certainly sounded ominous, didn't it? That seemed like a good enough time to activate his trap. Perhaps if Ecrisdis found himself bound once more, he could be blackmailed or something. Honestly, he was running out of ideas. The man was obviously insane. Like, seriously, who the fuck invited a fucking eldritch being, a devourer of realms, into the world? This was a man who would quite willingly let the world burn. And there's a good chance that it would burn. Overpowered magic or not, There was a chance that Dumbledore and Grindelwald would be able to kill him, meaning that Harry would be trapped here forever. At least until the breach becomes unstable again and Nidhogg devours the material realm. Yeah, he needed to get out of this place, fucking Voldemort. How that man is what remains of Tom Riddle, Harry had no idea. The boy had been charming and powerful and definitely wouldn't have been foolish enough to do anything like this, even if he was as desperate. Then again, Tom Riddle did rip out his own soul as a teenager, so he wasn't exactly a pillar of common sense. Of course, right as the trap was about to activate, the rune matrix shattered like glass and Echrisdis raised an eyebrow. Well, that was very impressive. You've barely had minutes with my magic and came up with this. Don't worry. I won't bind you to this place. I don't need to, after all. See, have a look. Turned towards Echrisdis, only to find himself outside the cavern. There was a familiar golden shield surrounding them, staving off Nidhogg's influence. This didn't feel like space manipulation. Harry spread his senses, trying to understand how he got there, only to gasp and fall to the ground. Everything felt off, like the world itself was tilted. He couldn't breathe. It was someone who had turned off his arcane hearing. No, it was still there, just wrong. What was going on? He palmed his wand and tried to cast any magic, but everything felt wrong. He glared at Echrisdis. What did you do? Nothing. As I said, not all prisons are physicals. We're just outside the cavern, where my spell that grants you the perception over magic has failed. You just lost your ability to use Solomon's magic, nothing more. But that's not it, is it? Everything just feels grayer, magic is so bland and tasteless. That's because nothing will ever compare to what you felt inside the cave. I know you will not leave, because you will always crave the insight. You will always return of your own free will. Harry pointed his wand at Echrisdis, his hand shaking. I could kill you now. Perhaps you could, the man answered, visibly amused. But even in the very unlikely scenario where you achieve this fear, it still wouldn't change anything, would it? You'll still return to the cavern, craving your new magic. I wonder how long you'll hold out before you snap. Don't feel so bad. You were always going to be bound here. I just needed someone to agree to take my place. Your companion might have agreed to my deal in his greed and fear, but if he hadn't, I would have tortured you all until one of you snapped. This certainly is more pleasant, isn't it? It certainly was the most merciful way to bind you to this place. You're a monster, Echrisdis, Harry gritted out. I am. I never denied it. That doesn't mean that my actions have no great purpose. And please stop pointing that thing at me. I don't think you could cast any magic anymore, so it's barely more than a stick in your hands. Don't worry, once I'm done, I'll make my spell permanent and you'll be allowed to leave, capable of using Solomon's magic anywhere. He was right, Harry didn't think he could cast any magic. The way he would manipulate magic just felt empty, so inefficient. It was like someone who was used to the modern world being forced to build a house with his bare hands or trying to read a book while only knowing a single letter. Everything felt so imprecise, so wrong. It felt more like a psychological block stopping him from casting everything than any form of magic. Every part of Harry urged him to return to the cavern, to get back to a place where the world made sense once more. But he also knew that if he went back, he would never leave. Harry felt the wand in his hand warm up. The resurrection stone as well as the cloak pulsed in, and reassured him. It filled the oppressing silence with something of its own. His crest warmed up, and Harry felt his own magic click once more. It didn't stop the feeling that something was missing, that his magic felt inefficient and incomplete, but it wasn't the main thought inside him. After all, what was magic in front of death? Harry looked straight at his opponent and spoke up. No. Echrisdis' smile turned condescending. No. Very close, but no. It was all very neat, very organized, and certainly very clever, but you made a mistake. You could have walked out of here without any opposition and gone on your suicide mission to confront the light and dark champions on your own. And what mistake is that? Harry grinned. You really should have made sure that I couldn't leave the cave. There is such thing as being too clever. And just like that, Harry used all the Hallows at once, using his very soul to activate them, letting his crest take over. The young wizard enjoyed the shocked look on Echrisdis's face as their surroundings were consumed by a gigantic wave of shadows. 405. Chapter 405, Beneath the Sky. 10th May 1995, Azkaban. And just like that, Harry used all the Hallows at once, using his very soul to activate them, letting his crest take over. The young wizard enjoyed the shocked look on Echrisdis's face as their surroundings were consumed by a gigantic wave of shadows. Harry gasped as his attack petered out. He was standing in a crater, everything around him had turned into complete ash. The attack literally atomized everything around him. It was an ultimate expression of material death, entropy, and decay. Nothing should have survived this, and yet the familiar form of Azkaban's creator slowly faded back into reality, completely unbothered. This really wasn't fair. What was it with atomizing people not killing them recently? It literally vaporized people from existence. First Grindelwald did it, and now this creep. No, he would whine about it later. Now he had a rare moment to think, one that he stretched as much as possible to truly analyze the situation he was in. If Echrisdis were to be believed, his purpose was to kill the light and dark, the actual entities, not the champions. The fact that he actually had a plan to achieve that was beyond impressive, if it weren't for the fact that there was a good chance it would doom the world, of course. He also didn't want word of his return to spread around, so he would need to make sure that Harry wasn't in a position to do so. So, either imprisonment or death. Well, that certainly wasn't a good sign. A fight was almost a certainty. So, with a fight being ready, he needed to understand his opponent. His main advantage is Solomon's magic. He could cast magic that Harry's arcane hearing couldn't detect properly. He could generate from literal atoms. The most logical conclusion was some form of subspace, folded similarly to how Solomon's magic works, that actually anchors his soul. Very tricky to deal with. Now, onto Harry's advantages. He couldn't manipulate space considering how chaotic everything was because of the breach. However, the Deathly Hallows should theoretically work. They shouldn't be restricted to only one form of magic. He could stretch their use to compensate for whatever was coming. Harry couldn't afford to be thrown back into the cavern. He knew that he wouldn't have the strength to leave again. Whatever nonsense that was happening with Echrisdis's body didn't mean that soul magic wouldn't hurt him. After all, souls were universal. A fragment of a plan started to form in Harry's mind, and the entire world returned back to normal. The former Dark Lord still hadn't made a move, even after having completely regenerated. He simply muttered, "How? How did you do it? How are you able to resist?" Harry gave him a cheeky grin. "Wouldn't you like to know?" After all, it wouldn't do to tell him his secrets, not when they made a very severe difference. It had been a while since Harry had been completely overwhelmed by skill against someone. Dumbledore and Grindelwald didn't exactly count, and even they relied a lot on the sheer power being a champion gave them. Don't get him wrong, they were extraordinarily skilled, but they probably haven't needed to exercise that skill in decades. To be completely honest, it was understandable. After all, if one were faced with a dragon, they wouldn't try to trick it if they could just kill it with a single swing of a sword. Other people didn't have that luxury. To be perfectly honest, Harry hadn't felt this outclassed but not outpowered in years. He would need to be clever and calculate things correctly. The first step to winning against a skillful opponent was to make them lose their focus, and Harry found that anger worked best. It seemed to have done an adequate job as the former Dark Lord snarled at him. "I'll enjoy tearing the secrets out of your screaming body, boy." Maybe it worked too well. Step 2 was analyzing his magic and seeing any pattern. That was the troublesome part. Before he could even try to cast anything, Harry found himself flying back towards a bunch of black spikes. He hadn't even noticed the magic being used. Damn it, that undetectable magic thing was definitely overpowered. By complete reflex, Harry activated the invisibility cloak and phased through them. As he fell down, he cast his Ice Age spell, literally freezing everything around him, which was a good thing, given the sword that threatened to impale him from above. His crest, without doing anything, channeled his magic to the Resurrection Stone, but it wasn't to manipulate someone else's soul, but his own. Harry's soul pulsed and he got some feedback. It wasn't nearly as exact as his arcane hearing, but it was more than enough to craft a basic counterspell. Well, calling it a counterspell would be a stretch. It was just a basic piece of magic that would destabilize it, as Harry couldn't really deal with all the spell's aspects yet. Without even knowing much, he cast it, causing an explosion that threw Acrisdis back. The father of the Dementors was able to conjure an invisible platform to land on, and looked shocked as he barely shielded against a beam of entropic energy that Harry tried to capitulate with. He sent a trio of spells which Harry couldn't visibly detect, but that his soul could make up for. It wasn't precise, but he could tell that one of them had to have an animated component, one was some form of curse, and the last was a form of elemental magic. Harry immediately destabilized the first two before using the Elder Wand to absorb the elemental magic coming his way. He used the Resurrection Stone to break down its counterparts, like a deep scan, which he stored in his family crest. With that done, he released the exact same spell at its caster. The whole thing took less than a fraction of a second, almost instantaneous, and was definitely more than a little risky. But it had worked. Acrisdis was thrown away by the invisible lightning bolt that broke his shield, and Harry now had a very good copy of the spell stored in the crest, which he could technically cast without fully understanding the mechanics of the magic. Acrisdis followed up with a massive spell, something that Harry didn't exactly understand, but was able to cast a counter to. It was funny, as efficient as his magic was, it was like a very delicate machine. It was extremely fragile. As the former Dark Lord was about to unleash the spell, the two collided, and the result was a very impressive explosion that Harry phased through with his invisibility cloak. Suddenly, hundreds of spells appeared out of nowhere and kept actively targeting him. Harry was barely able to activate his cloak and phase away in time. However, he took some pleasure in absorbing and analyzing the spells once more. Of course, that was when he noticed a gigantic meteor falling towards him. It had literally come out of nowhere. He destroyed it with a beam of necrotic energy, but had to dodge a red blade that threatened to skewer him. A knight made of some weird energy that rotted everything around it tried to kill him once more, only for Harry to use the Resurrection Stone to destabilize the animation spell, making the knight explode into red necrotic energy, faintly similar to his crest's magic. Had Acrisdis replicated the magic somehow, well, that wouldn't do. Suppressing a smirk, Harry cast dozens of spells that he had absorbed from Acrisdis. He didn't fully know what they did, and they definitely took the man off guard, given the fact that a couple of them actually hit the man, punching a gigantic hole through his chest. Not that it mattered, considering that the man regenerated from being atomized. Still, it gave Harry time to contain the spreading of the energy by freezing the entire area in time. And so the duel continued. Acrisdis's runes were immediately destabilized. Any form of direct magic was immediately absorbed and sent back at its wielder. And slowly but surely, Harry was getting a lot better at sensing Solomon's magic, his crest helping his arcane hearing detect the patterns in the spells he absorbed and translating them in a way that Harry could counter more efficiently. He noticed that the wounds on Acrisdis' body were not regenerating as quickly as when he was hit with his own magic. His regeneration was probably based on Solomon's magic, and his version of spells probably took more energy somehow. Harry couldn't help but feel disappointed. In terms of magical knowledge, Acrisdis was by far the superior. He bent space in ways that Harry couldn't even understand, and manipulated the world around him with such ease and precision that he couldn't help but be envious. However, the sad truth was that without the element of surprise, without his undetectable magic, Acrisdis was weirdly predictable. He didn't really act like a fighter, but more like a scientist that never expected. Yeah, Harry didn't see him beating Dumbledore or Grindelwald in a straight fight. They would probably come up with some bullshit that would allow them to detect the magic, and he would die very quickly afterwards. Sure, Acrisdis was good in terms of magical use. He cast some very esoteric attacks, but he had obviously very rarely fought against anyone who could detect his magic. When Harry destabilized a hidden ritual that Acrisdis had discreetly been casting, the magic release blowing up in his face, the former Dark Lord was sent flying back, with burns on his body, slowly healing thanks to his regeneration. He limped up and snarled, "How are you doing this?" All magic must have a grounding in reality to be able to express itself into the world, he simply stated. But I do have a question. What exactly are you hoping to achieve with this? Do you seriously think that a couple of Dementors would stop two of the strongest champions to exist since Merlin and Morgana? Is truly all you can do? You want to know what I can do? Echrisdis spoke up hysterically. Who am I to refuse? He conjured some weird black dagger out of nowhere and stabbed it into his own heart. Before Harry could even understand what was happening, the entire world screamed. The air rippled like disturbed water, but colder, bone-chilling cold. The ground under Echrisdis cracked, as if recoiling from him, glowing with an eerie red light that spread like a sinister infection. Then reality seemed to tear itself open. Shadows poured out, thick and alive, swallowing the light and twisting the space around them into something unrecognizable. From the void, monsters emerged, things that shouldn't exist, things no one should ever see. The first was a massive shifting blob of flesh, covered in unblinking eyes that darted in every direction. It dragged itself forward on tentacles tipped with jagged claws, each step leaving behind sizzling pools of black goo similar to Nidhogg's corruption. Another monstrosity followed, taller and stranger. It looked vaguely human. If a human were stretched like taffy, with arms that bent the wrong way and a mouth that split its face in half. Inside that gaping maw were too many teeth, all jagged and yellow, snapping like a wild animal. The worst was a slithering shadow with scales that shimmered like liquid, lined with mouths that whispered, no, hissed, making Harry want to claw at his ears. The world around them wasn't faring any better. The ground pulsed with veins of something alive and wrong. Even the sky dimmed, dark clouds spiraling into a churning void that felt like it was watching. Echrisdis stood there, grinning like a madman, his voice warped and echoing, "Do you like it? This is just a glimpse of what lies beyond the thin curtain of the material world. I based it on the Dark Champion, who killed my family. He was a vile thing, traveling the continent, leaving nothing but blood and horror at his tail. I came home one day and found my wife and my daughters cut down like beasts, and for what? For some experiments. When I tracked him down, I found him pretending to be some noble knight. He had fallen in love, you see. He thought that he could just ignore what he had done before, that he could move past the pain he caused me, that he caused everyone. Oh, how I enjoyed watching his maiden burn and writhe in agony, accused of being a witch. I wasn't even that hard to arrange, just a few whispers here and there while he was away, and it was already too late. The agony on his face when he realized what had happened. Grill de Rice broke that day. All that power, and yet he hadn't seen me coming. He died, consumed by madness and grief. I found his laboratory. His research was quite enlightening. He looked lost in his head for a fraction of a second before his madness returned. Do you see now what I can do, boy? Tell me, do you still think I still don't have a chance against them? Harry stumbled back, his wand trembling in his hand. The creatures didn't just feel wrong. Something primal inside him wanted to squash it down. And so he let his instincts control everything and started to sing. To be honest, even to this day, he had no clue how his singing worked properly. All he knew was at certain moments when he felt the more vulnerable. When the stars aligned when he needed it the most, he could sing, and the world would listen. Even though there were more than enough space-time anomalies all over the island, even though there were monsters who definitely didn't belong in the material realm, even though there were hundreds of reasons why it shouldn't have worked, reality shifted around him. Slowly, shades of grey started to surround Harry. It was oddly calming. Everything in his surroundings drowned. As the sky turned grey, the monsters pushed back slowly, unable to enter. He understood now why the Olympians said that he sang a realm into existence. He couldn't deny it. This was, by definition, a realm. It obeyed certain rules, ones that he sang into being. It was separated from the outside world, but it wasn't perfect. Harry felt the creatures, the wrongness that they inflicted onto the world, try to infect his realm as well. But he would not budge. In a way, they existed by bringing shards of their own existence with them, something immaterial to materialize their existence. Quite the paradox, huh? Still, this is a threat that shouldn't be allowed, which he needed to get rid of. Harry pushed his realm outward, urging it to grow. Death fought against the void as Azkaban slowly cracked and burned. He was at a stalemate, and he knew it. He needed to do something to break it, because even if he matched the damn monstrosities, he couldn't outlast them. He needed to come up with something, and he had to do it now. The portal was definitely the weak point of the spell, and he would need to close it with a single attack. Fortunately for Harry, he was a bit of an expert on the subject. Even when it was completely alien, the principles behind the portal remained the same. Harry remembered the magic his crest had analyzed, trying to understand a bit of the principles behind it. It wasn't perfect, but his crest did an admirable job of breaking it down. He slowly shaped his magic and manipulated space and time in his own realm, specifically targeting the immaterial realm whose energy surrounded those beings, which happened to weirdly align with the magic, and he channeled a bit of the resurrection stone while doing so. This was the best he could do with what he had, and with a yell he waved his wand and the cutting charm was released. A slash of red energy, one that was folded into itself, strangely similar to his multi-dimensional attack, flew toward his attackers. Harry dispelled his realm right as it was about to exit, and the attack continued slashing through the creatures as if they were made through butter. It continued on and on until it reached the portal, which exploded in a gigantic burst of energy and light. When the light came out, there were no signs of the nightmarish creatures, just a crater and a reforming skeleton, which kneeled to the ground, the growing flesh on his face showing Ecrisdis' absolute shock and despair. "Who are you?" "I am Harry Potter, the last Peveril, master of the Deathly Hallows. You, Ecrisdis, have violated the sanctity of this realm. For this, I sentence you to death." Without saying another word, Harry conjured a scythe made of ice, which he channeled the resurrection stone into and swung it, decapitating the former Dark Lord. Harry felt his soul finally fade away, ensuring that he was finally dead. However, a small spark of golden energy flew up from the corpse and slowly shaped itself like Ecrisdis' former disguise, only this time the eyes were different. They were more detached, and yet more regal somehow. There was wisdom where Ecrisdis' barely contained madness had resided before. "Solomon," Harry whispered. The man nodded slightly before turning back into a golden spark and flying toward Ecrisdis' tomb. Harry followed him instinctively and walked inside. As if it had been waiting for him, the black tar attacked once more, trying to break through the golden shield. Ecrisdis might be dead, but there was still the mess with Nidhogg, wasn't there? Harry still had to close the breach, didn't he? For fuck's sake, when will this fucking day end? 406, Chapter 4. 06, Nail in the Coffin. 10th May, 1995, Azkaban. The man nodded slightly before turning back into a golden spark and flying toward Ecrisdis' tomb. Harry followed him instinctively and walked inside. Ecrisdis might be dead, but there was still the mess with Nidhogg, wasn't there? For fuck's sake, when will this fucking day end? Harry looked at the entrance of the cave, feeling exhausted. Singing a realm into existence was very draining, even if he could think of a lot of ways to optimize the spell using Solomon's magic. He had a very basic grip on the principles of the magic system. It wasn't enough to even call himself knowledgeable of the subject, but he had worked from worse. After all, he had taken the space expansion charm and practically built an entire field of magic from it. Still, he entered the cavern with trepidation, remembering how difficult it was to leave this place. However, he still needed to deal with the breach and get Voldemort, which meant that he had to go back and resist once more the temptation of staying there until the end of days, studying Solomon's magic. However, just as he was about to enter, he froze. He remembered how those creatures were able to sustain themselves in the material world. Harry sang softly and a small film surrounded him, protecting him from any outside influence. That was a pretty interesting way to use his magic, which was very simple. The spell itself was surprisingly easier than he expected. He had no idea why that was the case, but he would worry about that later. He took a step forward and smiled as his idea worked. Harry found no alien perception of the world or of magic, and took a sigh of relief. Yes, his protections must have worked. He walked forward, easily bypassing the basic tests that Ecrisdis had put in place, finding himself illuminated by their true purpose. They were tests, but they were designed to measure someone's viability for Ecrisdis' plan. Whoever he planned on tricking would have to be magically proficient enough to take his place and have a good understanding of magic, while also being intelligent enough to get to the tomb in the first place. If Harry had to guess, Enchanting did this to stop poachers from finding this place and wanted a power-hungry or reckless scholar to trick. It would have probably worked if he hadn't overestimated the intelligence of most people. After all, he had created a veritable fortress for his experiments, and the government of magical Britain used it as a prison of all things, where he must have expected Azkaban to be a mysterious tomb that scholars and cursebreakers would have loved to explore. It became a government asset that no one would ever want to step foot into. Without a doubt, Enchanting had failed, and now Harry had to deal with the consequences of that decision. Arriving at the now-dead man's tomb, Harry watched as Voldemort slumped, obviously in pain. He looked at the young wizard and let out a smile. "I assume that Enchanting is dead." "He is. He put up quite the fight." "I see that his death didn't free you from your binding," Harry responded neutrally. Harry used his soul to check for any hidden magic and noticed the obvious binding that surrounded Voldemort. The Dark Lord promised his help, but he didn't specify how long it would take. Only Enchanting could say that the act was over, and with him dead, there was no one that could free Voldemort from his service. The heir of Slytherin chuckled bitterly. "I should have listened to you, Potter." Harry nodded. "You should have. To be fair to you, neither of us expected a verbal agreement to become binding using magic we didn't understand. But I did warn you, if something is too good to be true, then it probably is." "I know, I was reckless. I was—" The man didn't seem to finish the sentence, so Harry did it for him. "You were scared. You became mortal for the first time in decades, and you couldn't risk shattering your soul, making another Horcrux. It feels so meaningless. I'm technically immortal now, staying in this cave forever. This was my greatest desire, but I can't help but doubt if it was worth it. I'll forever be alone, for decades, maybe centuries. And then I'll be forgotten. Just a meaningless name, a fake one at that. It was my deepest fear, you know. It was never about dying. It was about not being remembered, not mattering in the grand scheme of things." "What about the light and dark?" he asked. The Dark Lord chuckled bitterly. "Don't get me wrong, I hate them with a passion. The destruction they brought. But my obsession with killing them was never about justice, not really. I wanted to be known as the man who destroyed the light and dark, who subjugated them for an eternity, who would use their power to create a new world, a better world. And here, look at me. There's no escape from this. I now have the power to achieve my dream, but I have lost my freedom to do so. Don't bother. I took some time analyzing my bindings. There's nothing either of us could do." Harry didn't have the heart to tell him that his access to Solomon's magic was completely bound to this place, and that even if he had found a way out, he wouldn't be able to do shit against Dumbledore or Grindelwald. It would have been cruel after all. Seeing Voldemort there, seemingly as calm as possible while also being regretful, it reminded Harry of Tom Riddle, the boy he killed to become this monster. Even with his soul torn off, there had to be something of Tom beneath the hate, anger, and fear. Maybe it helped that Voldemort looked human and not like some gross serpentine thing, but he had never been so human. It was a shame that it took being practically enslaved and imprisoned for an eternity to do that. Curious, Harry asked, "Do you have any regrets?" "A few, perhaps. I regret attacking the Longbottom boy. That was foolish of me. I regret ever coming to this place and falling for Enchanting's tricks. Perhaps I should have made sure that my diary didn't have so much autonomy. But the path I have taken, it was mine, and I would not change it for anything. Who knows, maybe after a few centuries I'll figure out how to escape this place. Perhaps this is not the end of Lord Voldemort." Why did he have to say that? He was never going to stop, was he? This man had destroyed lives, waged a useless war while being used as a pawn, and yet regretted only the outcome, not what he had done. To be fair, his sense of morality was skewed, to say the least, and there was no use for the recklessness or the madness. With a heavy heart, Harry knelt down to look Voldemort in the eye and murmured, "I'm sorry." Voldemort's face turned to confusion before morphing into pain as Harry stabbed him in the heart with a dagger of ice in which he channeled the resurrection stone. It was the right thing to do. Lord Voldemort had proven during their brief time together that he'd make reckless decisions without consulting him. Even if he wasn't bound, Harry knew that their partnership wouldn't have worked out, and he would have become more of a liability than an asset. But the fact that he was bound also mattered. If Voldemort still lived, there was every chance that Dumbledore would find him, and Harry would have essentially made his job even easier, a prepared lamb for slaughter for his final ritual. Killing Voldemort before the task was always a path that Harry had been considering. So far, he had only stayed his hand because of Vlad's help, and the prospect of having a powerful ally against the champions on Light and Dark. The Dark Lord's red eyes slowly lost their meager light, the hatred constantly burning inside them finally extinguished. He couldn't even wish Riddle better luck in his next life, for he would experience no reincarnation. He would remain in the void for an eternity, alone, suffering. He had broken death's rules, and now he had to pay the price. Fancy soul magic or not, there was nothing Harry could do to stop that. It should have been a victory. Lord Voldemort's death over a decade prior had been celebrated by an entire country. So much so that it threatened to break the statute of secrecy, with Neville Longbottom becoming a national celebrity. And yet, all Harry could feel was emptiness. The man was a monster, he knew that for a fact, but he couldn't help but mourn the potential that would never be realized, the boy that the monster used to be. Tom Riddle was a brilliant young wizard who could have saved the world, and all that remained was the husk of a man who did his best to throw away everything that made him human. Of course, Harry didn't get to contemplate too much. After all, he had just broken a prophecy after all. He liked to think that if Voldemort would have liked to die, he'd have liked to have done it as a final fuck you for Dumbledore. There was something very satisfying about destroying the former headmaster's decades' worth of planning. After all, with this gone, all the crap he did with the boy who lived, all the manipulations, the boy he was planning on martyring, all of that became entirely meaningless. The magical release of the broken prophecy pulsed, and the young wizard used the Elder Wand to absorb it all, every single drop. He brought Voldemort into his realm momentarily to make sure that there wasn't any bleed-through, and that Nidhogg wouldn't use the energy to make his tear in reality even bigger. Harry grabbed the book in Voldemort's hand, the grimoire he had come to retrieve, and slowly walked out of the cavern and back into the breach. He was able to overwhelm whatever space-time anomalies there were with the sheer power of the prophecy and found himself in front of a familiar small pool of black tar that covered Nidhogg's breach. It would probably take a few years for the breach to fully close without anyone actively sustaining it. But that was more than enough for some idiot to mess things up, and Harry had enough. Harry would not risk it. With a flick of his wand, he directed the magic stored inside it and commanded the breach to close. The entity quickly realized what had happened and was fighting, but Harry had a prophecy's worth of magic behind him. His goal was to undo everything that Acrisdis had ever done, destroying his legacy. It took a while, but the defenses protecting the material realm from outside influence finally activated and helped Harry close the breach, including any form of space warping involved. This meant that the Dementors would also perish. He didn't see anyone protesting that. With that done, Harry started to sing, taking over Azkaban 1 meter at a time, destroying whatever taint. He released a gigantic pulse of light which destroyed whatever corrupted creatures remained, and the entire island was reduced to rubble. Azkaban was finally destroyed, the ambient magic surrounding it having lost its taint, and he could feel the world itself be grateful for it. No one would know what he did that day. No one would know of the threat he had just disposed of. With that done, Harry just felt drained and exhausted. He knelt, watching his handiwork. As he was contemplating his choices, the grimoire in Harry's hand burst into motes of golden light that morphed into a familiar form once more. From the look in his eyes, Harry knew who it was. The otherworldly detachment and wisdom were more than enough to make a very educated guess. Solomon, I'm guessing. Are you actually going to speak this time, or are you going to vaguely guide me somewhere else too? Yeah, maybe Harry was a little irritable. Perhaps it was a stupid idea, but he was out of fucks to give. Funnily enough, that seemed to amuse Solomon more than anything, given the small upward twitch of his lips. Yes, young hero, I believe it's time for us to have a proper conversation. 407, Chapter 4, 07, A Raven's Touch. 10th May, 1995, Azkaban. Yeah, maybe Harry was a little irritable. Perhaps it was a stupid idea, but he was out of fucks to give. Funnily enough, that seemed to amuse Solomon more than anything, given the small upward twitch of his lips. Yes, young hero, I believe it's time for us to have a proper conversation. They stayed silent for minutes, Harry not really knowing how to start the conversation. There was a lot that he wanted to ask him, mainly about how he defeated the light and dark, and why he didn't help him before. A part of him wanted to ask him about his magical system, why he even let himself die, because functional immortality shouldn't have been much of an issue for him. However, whatever he had to say just wouldn't leave his throat, and Solomon decided to speak up first. You made the right decision. Harry gave him a confused look, and the king clarified, in Ecrisdis' tomb, killing the man with the broken soul, it was the right decision. The world is so full of greys that it's rare to really differentiate between right and wrong. When I was king, I made many decisions for the good of my people, and the decision you made was for the good of the world. No good would have come from sparing that man. The young wizard froze at that before answering, it doesn't feel like it. I've killed people before, but it was always in a fight, and they were always enemies. Voldemort was an ally, and I killed him when he was imprisoned, bound to a cavern, stuck with an oath that he would never fulfill. I didn't kill him because of what he could do, but what someone else could do with his survival, for a greater good, I suppose. I can't help but wonder if that's what they felt like, Dumbledore and Grindelwald, I mean, when they got started in the journey that twisted them so. The former monarch gave Harry a sympathetic look. Like it or not, the idea of the greater good itself isn't evil. It's a slippery slope, a justification that people use to justify their misdeeds. However, the idea itself is a noble one. I find that judging the act itself, without any external form of validation tainting my view, always helped me decide on whether or not to take that action. Tell me, how many people have you hurt by killing this man? Only Voldemort, he replied, and he deserved a lot more than death for what he had done. And thus, your decision to end his life was a good one. It's always a fine line to walk. I, myself, devoted decades to mastering divination to get a clearer idea of the consequences of my decisions. Unfortunately, you do not have decades to do the same. Ragnarok is coming. The last Potter let out a bitter chuckle, and here I thought you wanted to talk about philosophy. I just stopped one apocalypse, what's one more? Perhaps in another life, we would have spent more time discussing our interests. However, as pressing as it all is, there's something that I need to tell you first. Harry braced himself for the worst, only for the former monarch to speak up, with a gentle look on his face. You've done a good job. He froze. The last Potter didn't even know why he did, but that had to be the last thing he expected from the King of Mages himself. If anything, Solomon seemed even amused by his reaction. I've seen your feats, your decisions, your failures and successes. I can tell you without a doubt that generally speaking, I don't think there's anyone who could have achieved what you have. Perhaps it truly is destiny that dictated that someone like you would be born when the world needs him most. Perhaps it's a complete coincidence. Who can tell? But that doesn't matter. You did a very good job fighting the light and dark. Perhaps more than anyone else has in history. The young wizard didn't know why he was so taken aback by Solomon's words. Perhaps it was because no one ever really validated his actions and decisions. No one told him he did a good job because it was very rare for there to be an outside opinion that was aware of the scope of his actions. Harry shook his head, denying it. But I started Ragnarok. I killed the world serpent. I caused all of this. He did feel a lot of responsibility for what happened, mostly because he started Ragnarok by killing the world serpent. The fact that his ignorance could possibly have caused the end of times was weighing pretty heavily on him. It was one of the reasons why he didn't grab his close ones and fucked off to another universe, living comfortably. He was tied to Ragnarok, perhaps as its hero, and he learned that there was no outrunning this. Solomon's smile, though, was gentle. Whoever said that Ragnarok was a bad thing? What do you mean? It's literally the end of the world. Is it? The white-haired man spoke up in a smug tone. You've learned dozens of times that prophecies are rarely absolute and people seldom truly understand them. Harry didn't look convinced, and so Solomon spoke up. Do you want to know what would have happened had you not killed the world serpent? The champions of light and dark would have continued scheming in the background. After graduating, you would have moved away from Europe, consumed by your research of magic. Eventually, in a couple of decades, the magic that remained in the grimoire would have failed. Ekrisdis would have been free. He would have killed all the residents of Azkaban in a ritual, but he would have overshot it, unknowingly releasing enough magic for the breach to destabilize. Unknowing of his blunder, he would have ignored it and hunted down the light and dark, and perished horribly. However, the breach would have slowly expanded, and after a century or two, Nidhogg would have consumed the material realm. Whatever response Harry was expecting, well, it wasn't that. A part of him wanted to deny it, but it all felt so possible. He was fully willing to leave Britain after his graduation, stay the fuck away from Dumbledore and Grindelwald. He could see himself easily do that, and without Ragnarok, the champions of the light and dark wouldn't have had to do their elaborate ritual, breaking prophecies, and would have continued scheming. Ekrisdis' misdeeds wouldn't have been known, and when he was eventually defeated without anyone knowing about the breach in Azkaban, then there was nothing to stop Nidhogg from eventually winning. But there was something that Harry didn't like about that explanation. Then why did you let Ekrisdis use the grimoire to summon Nidhogg in the first place? Why else? It was because you needed to see it. You couldn't have sent a note or something. Thousands of people died because of what he did. The former king looked solemn for a minute. It wouldn't have been enough. As I said, you needed to see it. It might seem confusing now, but you'll understand eventually. I am not asking you to trust me, because I do not need it. The past is the past. There is not changing it. The future will be up to you. Harry deflated, anger still simmering before speaking up. What now? I stopped one terrible fate, but how is Ragnarok not worse? Nidhogg's victory would have decimated everything, but whoever said that Ragnarok would have be the end? As impossible as that might seem, there is a path to victory, one that has been paved for you, prepared for thousands of years. Fate and death are on your side, but nothing is absolute. But I suppose a little help wouldn't be amiss. Before Harry could even process the words, a small ball of golden light flew towards Harry's chest, integrating into his family crest, which started to glow faintly. What the hell was that? As I said, a small gift. In your crest are now the details on how to use my magic, with a few small gifts along the way. Harry channeled his crest slightly and gasped. It wasn't because of Solomon's magic, not really, but a small piece of information. Something that truly gave Harry hope. The location of the light and dark, their original dimensions before their expansion, their core. How? Solomon answered his question with one of his own. Do you know how I defeated the light and dark? Harry shook his head, and the former monarch continued. It wasn't some grand feat or battle like you ever expected. They were barely teens at the time, powerful but unrefined. I tricked them into a battlefield and sealed their soul into myself. They barely felt anything, and I couldn't use the light and dark. Not directly without them noticing. I usually used them as ways to channel more magic from my body, nothing more. But in my century of life, I did my best to understand the entity behind them, enough to have a target. A lot of divination showed me that my chances of victory were very slim, and so I passed on my duty forward. You couldn't have contained the light and dark. You didn't have to die. I did. What do you think would have happened if I had remained living? The light and dark would have eventually realized what had happened, that I tricked them. It might have taken centuries, but it was inevitable. The light and dark would either find a workaround or would have overwhelmed me enough to free the souls of their champions. They would have come back with a vengeance and would have razed my nation, who wouldn't have known hardship for centuries, to the ground. Everything ends, young hero, me included. It was my duty to aid humanity as much as I could, and I did so by choosing you and dying at a time which made the chances of victory be at their highest. The young wizard was suppressing the urge to shudder at the responsibility on his shoulder. Why me? I needed someone to pass my duty into, in an era where the very circumstances would help, where the stars would align. In a weird way, fate aided me. My visions were too precise, too explicit to be natural. Prophecies shouldn't be broken, and if they were, no form of divination should have predicted them. Something was aiding me, letting me see past what was possible. And so, I looked forward and saw a path to victory, a true victory, your path. I put things in motion to give you every advantage that you can have and hope for the best. My grimoire was one of them. Knowledge which I enchanted to be known in an exact moment it was needed. Icrisdis was my greatest gamble, but one of the most important. And now its purpose is fulfilled. I have faith in you, Harry Potter, but do not despair. Your existence, your actions, cannot make things worse than what they could have been. There was a detail, though, that angered Harry. So everything I suffered, everything I lost, it was all part of a script. Did any choice I make even matter? Of course they mattered, Solomon replied. Your choices are yours. I just knew what they were before you made it. You were never forced to do anything. You were never constrained. Everything that you ever experienced was completely due to your decisions. You can leave. You can give up. You can do whatever you want. No one is going to force you. It's also why I said that you had a path to victory, not that it is assured. It's a very faint difference, but it's an extremely important one. Your choices are your own, Harry Potter. They always have, and they always will be. Having calmed down slightly, he uttered, How can I trust you? How can I know that you really did all of this? How do I know that you won't keep dictating my actions? The white-haired man let out a smug smile. That's easy, young man. You do not have to trust me, you do not have to fear me, because I am not here. I have died thousands of years ago. The grimoire was never sentient. It had preordained instructions. Even this conversation is one that I recorded before my death. So let me assure you, you have everything you need to succeed. Whether you walk the path I laid for you will depend on your choices and yours alone, but I have faith in you, Harry Potter. Slayer of the World Serpent, Last Peveril, Master of Death, and the Raven's Chosen. Your legacy always was one of greatness, whichever path you take. I believe it's time for you to go home, for a storm is coming and may fortune favor. And just like that, the man faded away, the grimoire having disappeared with him, leaving a gaping Harry flabbergasted by the idea that he was talking with someone who had recorded his answers years prior. He felt a touch of absolution for everything he had ever done in his life so far, every wrong, every death that his actions had accidentally caused. He hadn't realized how much he blamed himself until some invisible weight disappeared from his shoulder. But most of all, he felt relieved. There he had it. There was a path to victory, a way to win. Even if he didn't know what it was, not really, someone who knew the future had faith in him, and that removed any idea of giving up, of escaping to another universe from his mind. He would find that path and walk it, if only for the sake of everyone who suffered for thousands of years, who died to forge this. With barely a gesture, Harry opened a portal and walked forward. He had one last stop to make before going home after all. After all, there was still one piece of the puzzle that was missing. 408, Chapter 4, 08, Blood Ties. 10th May 1995, Land of Shadows. He would find that path and walk it, if only for the sake of everyone who suffered for thousands of years and who died to forge this. With barely a gesture, Harry opened a portal and walked forward. He had one last stop to make before going home after all. After all, there was still one piece of the puzzle that was missing. Harry closed the portal behind him, his gaze meeting the familiar form of Vlad's castle. It was just as ominous as it was when he first entered it. He couldn't help but feel slightly worried. Vlad Dracul was a very dangerous man, and that was underplaying it. Tales of his origins were a bit fragmented, but from Nicholas's diary he knew that he used a wizard who wished to be immortal and crafted a ritual that ended up accidentally killing off a champion of the dark. The first vampire was extremely fast, had a mastery of magic that very few people would boast, and was functionally immortal, the dark refusing to let him die until he fulfilled his purpose. And yet, as Harry walked into the dining room, he didn't see the Lord of Shadows, or whatever pretentious title people threw on him, but a tired man drinking wine. He turned to Harry and spoke up. "Did you find the grimoire?" The young wizard simply nodded. "It was where you said it was." "And Riddle?" He didn't make it, Harry bluntly responded. There was something that had made Harry dubious of the vampire's decision. He never said why he wanted Voldemort to come with him. The young wizard had thought that he wanted them to work together, to partner up against Dumbledore and Grindelwald. But he was wrong. Solomon said that it was all planned out, and now that he thought about it, Voldemort's death broke his prophecy, which was enough for Harry to seal off Nidhogg's breach. Everything aligned too perfectly, and since Vlad was the one who suggested bringing Voldemort along, he had to have answers. The vampire slumped further into his seat and drank another gulp of wine. Finally, he spoke up. "I'm supposed to be happy, you know. I'm finally free of that cursed book. How I wish I never found that thing. Hope can be such a dangerous thing after all." "The ritual you used to become a vampire, it came from the grimoire." "No, it didn't. That ritual was entirely my own. I crafted it after decades of experimentation and research and countless lost lives. I thought I did it. I thought that I had finally found my path to immortality, and I succeeded. I should have known that it was too good to be true. I was reckless and performed it, only to find myself bound to the dark. After a lot of experience, I realized that it shouldn't have worked. I should have died that day, but it was the dark that saved me. It was the dark that bound me, and a piece of it lies in every single vampire that existed ever since. I found the grimoire centuries later, after I had almost given up on ending my curse. I found it in a tomb in the middle of nowhere. I hoped that it would have something that could help. Imagine my surprise when I found, instead of obscure magical knowledge, instructions addressed directly to me, promising me my freedom of the dark in exchange for completing a few tasks. They seemed like a very small price to pay for my freedom. I wasn't even asked to do anything particularly bad. Just give someone a letter or another, pass down the grimoire and retrieve it from certain locations. That's the thing, I was never really forced to do anything. I was never magically bound, and yet I felt imprisoned. As I said, hope, after all, can be a very dangerous thing. The vampire took a sip of his wine while staring back at the sky. It took me embarrassingly long to realize that Solomon had to have been a seer, had to have known what would have happened to me, and had to have wanted a spy on the dark. The King of Mages was dead, and yet I served him somehow, like a puppet with an invisible string, bound by my hope, by the idea of freedom. I thought that I was done after the mess with Ecrisdis. There was no instruction to pick up the grimoire afterwards, not for centuries. I thought that either Solomon had failed, or my role was over. It wouldn't be a lie if I said that I was leaning towards the former. He let out a bitter chuckle. Imagine my surprise when I found letters addressed to me with very familiar handwriting appearing out of thin air, with small instructions written on them. The first was to take care of a young wizard who would seek me out. Days later, I found a young man by the name of Tom Riddle knocking on my doorstep, a young man who had ripped apart his own soul. I don't know if it was the familiar fear of death that had plagued my youth being so clear in his eyes, but I took him under my wing and cared for him. Harry gave him a dubious look. "You cared for him?" The vampire nodded. "I did. Far more than I ever expected. It was easy. Perhaps it was because I was a monster myself that I found myself attached to another one with familiar fears and familiar dreams that I held in my youth. Then I went to hide from Grindelwald during his war and stayed here, in my realm, away from his sight. I asked Tom to come with me, and yet he refused, as I knew he would. He called me a coward and wanted me to join his pointless crusade against the light and dark. When I refused, he left, saying that he would never return until he had completed his purpose, and so I never expected to see him again. Imagine my surprise when years later I found a letter telling me to send the both of you to Azkaban to retrieve Solomon's grimoire. Merely days after, I found Tom on my doorstep, and then you came. I had my suspicions, of course, but some part of me hoped that it wouldn't be true. It wasn't the first time the grimoire surprised me after all. This was to be my final order, my final command. I am unbound, for I have played my part, and yet I do not feel free or unburdened. How peculiar. "Why are you telling me this?" the young wizard asked. "I have never had the opportunity to share my pain. And would you truly judge me for what I was forced to do? You too mourn him, even if it is very hidden, the first vampire answered. I mourn the wizard he could have been. I remember Tom Riddle, a brilliant young man who dreamed of a better world. Voldemort always felt like a pale shadow, more like a living manifestation of the darkness inside him than a person onto himself. They sat in silence, neither saying anything. Harry had gotten what he wanted, really. He understood the path that guided him to the grimoire, to Solomon's masterpiece. There was something profoundly haunting about seeing a person's life meticulously planned, from their first steps to their last breath. It felt unnatural, like seeing a marionette moving without its strings. Vlad Dracul was definitely a miserable man, bound to serve the dark, and yet Solomon twisted his hope to be free to turn him into a willing servant. There was no magical compulsion, no forceful will, and in a way, that was what made it sinister. Their choices were their own, and yet people knew about them before they made it. Perhaps it wasn't the choices that mattered, but the reason behind making them. Breaking the silence, Vlad finally spoke, his voice low and contemplative. How did he die? Harry met his gaze evenly. I killed him. He got tricked by Ecrizdis and bound to forever stay in his tomb. I killed him to destroy the tomb and everything that remained in Azkaban. The vampire raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. A mercy, then. I know personally how horrible immortality can be. Was it quick? Harry nodded solemnly. Very. He didn't feel a thing. That's good, Vlad murmured, taking a sip of wine. His crimson eyes seemed distant, lost in memories that spanned centuries. Harry wasn't sure why he lingered. Perhaps it was the broken look in Vlad's eyes, a reflection of his own guilt over Riddle's death. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a need to understand. He broke the silence again, his words unbidden. You know, I'm probably the reason he came back here. The vampire's eyes lit up slightly. I thought he was being hunted down by his own rogue Horcrux. Oh, that was complete nonsense. He went to attack my guardian, probably to pressure him into joining his cause, since every single one of his followers kept getting killed. I was still in hiding, hoping, in vain, that it would hide me from Grindelwald's sight. He attacked Arcturus while I was there, and it was like a reflex. I pretended to be his diary Horcrux. Vlad stared at him before a grin tugged at his lips. He fell for that? Surprisingly easily, Harry said, a trace of amusement in his voice. Riddle was always narcissistic. Who could pose a greater threat to him than himself? Of course, he denied it, until I used some basic soul magic to prod his soul. He thought I was trying to assimilate him and ran away. You should have seen his face. For the first time in their encounter, Vlad burst into genuine laughter, the sound rich and oddly human. I can picture it. He was so terrified when he arrived. I assumed he'd botched one of the rituals when he made the Horcruxes. Soul magic is unpredictable at best. Their laughter echoed in the chamber, a strange, fleeting moment of levity. It felt surreal to share a laugh with Vlad Dracul, a figure shrouded in legends and fear. When the laughter subsided, Vlad's expression softened, a rare vulnerability flickering in his eyes. There aren't many who mourn Tom. It's a comfort to know I'm not alone. People saw the monster, the madman who tore his soul apart, but Tom Riddle was still there, buried beneath the shadow of Voldemort. I'm glad I'm not the only one who remembers him. Harry nodded, an idea forming in his mind. It was impulsive, but he couldn't ignore the opportunity. Then why not ensure his sacrifice wasn't in vain? Why not join me against the light and dark? Vlad's expression darkened, and he shook his head slowly. You don't understand. I am a coward, Harry. I never denied it. Even after millennia, I still fear death. As much as I hate to admit it, there is no defeating the light and dark. This quest you've embarked upon is beyond foolish. You cannot grasp the scale of their power. They are eternal, beings whose reach spans realities. Gods and demons alike fall before them. The best you can do is kill their champions, and even that is a death sentence. New champions will rise, and the cycle will begin anew. I learned this the hard way. Harry hesitated, tempted to press him on that final comment, but chose his words carefully. Something is breaking the cycle. Ragnarok is coming. The light and dark will clash for the final time. You have nothing to lose. If it's truly the end of days, then death is inevitable. But if we survive, if we defeat them, wouldn't you want to be part of that victory? Wouldn't you want to avenge millennia of servitude for a mistake you made so long ago? Vlad stared past him, his eyes distant, unreadable. Harry stood, deciding to leave him with his thoughts. Just think about it, Vlad Dracul. Until next time. With that, Harry stepped through a portal, leaving the ancient vampire alone with his wine and his memories. After all, it was time to go home. 409, Chapter 4. 09, Man in Black. 12th. May 1995, St. Mungo's Hospital. Arcturus Black opened his eyes and winced at the brightness of his surroundings. The blinding light was already giving him a headache, which made it hard to think. He motioned to yell at Creature to close the bloody drapes, only to release a faint croaking sound. His throat burned slightly as if he hadn't spoken in a while, and when he tried to use his arms to shield himself from the sun, they felt as if they were made of lead. It took embarrassingly long to realize that he wasn't in his bed at the manor. It was too small and wasn't nearly as comfortable. Despite himself, he mumbled, "Where am I?" A woman's voice answered him, "Oh, Mr. Black, you're finally awake. You're in St. Mungo's for magical maladies and injuries. You were brought in after an incident in Diagon Alley." Oh, right. He was in Diagon Alley with Harry. They were separated, with Harry having decided to walk around the alley with his girlfriend while he was in Gringotts to deal with the paperwork of reactivating his vault. The goblins really did their best to make things difficult, since they assumed that they would have been given the contents of Harry's vault in a few decades. Extinct magical lines didn't happen often, but it was the bank and the ministry that gained the most from that. With Voldemort wiping out many family lines, they were projected to make quite a bit of gold in a few decades anyway. It was probably Fudge's way out of the dreadful pit hole that was magical Britain's economy. He probably hedged that even after a few decades, they would have access to enough funds to kick the ICW out. It would be too late. Their influence would have been very established, with an entire generation being born before that time, but it was still technically a safety net that Fudge could theoretically rely on by making the reckless move of allowing Gringotts to access dead vaults earlier for an increased fee. Of course, it would be a terrible precedent to make, and he didn't see the Wizengamot agreeing easily, but it was still a path to take. Thankfully, the minister had the foresight to use whatever leverage he had to kick out the ICW's influence, to the joy of a large majority of the members of the Wizengamot, so that risk was unlikely to happen. However, there was still a chance that the economy would be shaken once more. Where was he? Oh, right, he was leaving Gringotts and got attacked by lichens for some reason because they thought that Harry had killed the Red Witch. Which was preposterous, of course. His ward was many things and would kill a dangerous witch without any hesitation. But not his mother. No matter how much he liked to deny it, the boy still cared for her, and her death had shaken him. There was something fundamentally wrong about killing your own kin. Something deep inside their magic resisted the notion, which was why marriage was such an obvious way to build alliances between magical families. Sure, family crests were very important factors for old families, but not every family had the privilege of having one. Of course, arranged marriages ran out of favor after the statute of secrecy fell. Only certain families practiced them, and it was mostly to preserve certain magical traits from spreading outside the family. With a jolt, he sat up, ignoring how his bones ached at the action. "Harry." "Where's Harry?" "Your ward is fine, Mr. Black," the healer answered. "He visited you many times while you were here." "Many times? That didn't bode well. How long have I been here?" "Around 10 days. People were in an uproar about what happened, and the entirety of the lichen population went into hiding. I can't really blame them. It was really touch and go for a bit. A lot of the wounds, especially around your chest, resisted most of the healing charms we tried to cast. However, the bigger danger was the way you strained your magical circuits. You're very lucky that my supervisor specialized in that type of injury. At your age, I'm not exaggerating when I said that it's a miracle that you're still alive." "Believe me, I've been through worse," he muttered. The woman's eyes narrowed. "Oh, that I believe you. I've never treated anyone with so many scars, though a colleague of mine once treated Alastair Moody, so you might be behind on that front. She said that it was a miracle that he was even still alive. She didn't expect a reply since she continued casting while muttering to herself. Healers were always a mysterious bunch. He had no idea how they were trained in that guild of theirs, but anyone who could shape flesh and blood like clay was bound to lose a bit of their empathy. His attending healer seemed remarkably upbeat. Still, with most of his worries being abated, Arcturus took the time to observe his surroundings. It was a large room for a hospital, probably for his own privacy and status. There were a few flowers, violets, Melania's favorites. He always took care of the ones in the mansion personally as an homage to her. They were probably from Harry. He smiled faintly, only to stiffen as he saw a robed man standing silently by the door. It was easy to find out what he was. The way he was stiff, ready for any action, the dragonhide holster. "What's with the aura? Am I under arrest?" "Merlin, no," the woman answered while shaking her head. "Minister Fudge was kind enough to give you guards to make sure that there would be no repeats of the attack. It was in the Daily Prophet and everything." Arcturus gave her a dubious look. "Fudge arranged for my protection." A familiar voice spoke up, the door having been opened without a sound, probably a silencing charm. "Oh, he certainly wasn't very happy about it. I have to say, I heard rumors about your time in the Great War. It's nice to see that you haven't lost your edge." "Believe me, I was very rusty," Arcturus answered. "Why have you come, Amelia Bones? Didn't you hear? Our wise minister has declared that all available auras are to protect you from further attacks. Unfortunately, I happen to be one." "You're the head of the DMLE, Bones." The woman snorted. "I am, which is why I am quite vexed that instead of protecting the interest of this nation, I'm forced to stay here and make sure that you don't get yourself killed. It's a miracle that there hadn't been any other Lycan attacks. We were very lucky in that regard." Arcturus suppressed the urge to chuckle at that. More attacks. The Black Patriarch knew his ward, and he could say for a fact that the boy would guarantee that the Lycans wouldn't even try to do anything like that again, either through subjugation or termination. The fact that Harry obviously still visited him meant that whatever threat to his life was probably gone, especially since it had been 10 days since the incident. Still, there was something that didn't really make sense. Why did Fudge force you to do this? I appreciate it, of course, but it seems like a waste. Well, it had something to do with the Potter boy, I'm guessing. I don't know what exactly Fudge had been planning, but he asked dozens of my roster of auras to accompany him here after the attack. Apparently, he had gotten it into his head to arrest your ward for what happened. I'm genuinely not sure what his angle was. Maybe someone bought his allegiance. Maybe he thought that a scapegoat would help calm people down. It doesn't really matter. He called a state of emergency, citing complications with the Lycans and the goblins, and used that to issue a warrant without my involvement. All I can say is that Potter must have had balls of steel, and he definitely didn't like that. I'd respect the kid, but somehow he ended up convincing Fudge to have my auras act as glorified security guards. As you said, it was a waste of resources, which I'm hoping will be over now that you're awake. With that said, I'd appreciate it if you could shed some light on a few details of the attack. Do you have any idea about the motive behind it?" Arcturus obviously failed to hide the amusement he felt. It was just like Harry to do that. He liked being clever, using people's strengths against them. In Fudge's case, he practically hijacked his auras to protect Arcturus. He was touched, really, by the act. Harry wasn't one for outward acts of affection, neither was Arcturus for that matter. But this more than made up for it. The Black Patriarch honestly had no idea what Fudge was hoping to achieve with this. Harry hadn't even been here during the attack until the very end, where he caught Arcturus. He hadn't even cast a single spell, let alone killed any of the Lycans. Still, this still gave him an opportunity to curry favor with Bones. And what better way than to offer her information seemingly freely? The woman was likely to be the next minister after Fudge inevitably gets voted out next year, and she also had teams of auras under her command in case he would need to mess with one of Dumbledore's or Grindelwald's plans legally. He had been planning on speaking with her anyway, but she was either too busy or he had been preoccupied by his assets abroad. He took a deep breath and spoke up. "The Lycans thought I was involved somehow in the death of the Red Witch." They wanted revenge and more information about the scheme. Utter nonsense, of course, but they obviously believed it. The Bones matriarch froze at that. The Red Witch is dead. Arcturus didn't judge her for the way she reacted. The Red Witch was the main force behind the Lycans, both the source of their strength and restraint. Without her, the beasts were weaker, but far more unpredictable. But what he didn't expect was the way she paled in fear. Yes, she is. I had nothing to do with it, of course. But there's something you're not telling me. Come on, I was completely frank with you. It wouldn't hurt to share a bit. She glared at him before relenting. The Dementors have disappeared. Again, we feared that the Dark Lord made his move. And if the Red Witch is dead, he won't have any opposition. We haven't heard anything from the Lycans since the attack. It's very possible that they switched sides and found someone else to follow, even though the Dark Lord was probably the one who killed their previous master. I thought that things were settling down, but we're in the eye of the storm. The Black Patriarch knew that most of her assumptions were false. Harry had told him that Lycans had a form of enforced loyalty carved into their cause, and that they would never join someone that Lily considered an enemy. But the Dementor's disappearance was very disturbing. He had seen Harry threaten them with annihilation when they came with Riddle to attack him. They had backed off and went back to Tartarus, much to the confusion of most of the nation. For them to go rogue would mean that they felt secure in their position, in surviving Harry's threat. That was very dangerous indeed. He'd need to talk to Harry about it. Still, he had no plans of sharing his insight with the witch in front of him. After all, he couldn't have her drop her guard anytime soon with whatever Dumbledore and Grindelwald were planning. Thankfully, he didn't need to say anything, since a very familiar voice spoke up, filled with both mirth and relief. Well, you surely took your time to wake up from your little nap. I suppose that's age catching up with you. The auras in the room stiffened, their wands in their hands, and pointed at the intruder, only to relax at the sight of Harry Potter. He gave them a lazy wave. Hello, everyone? Please point your wands at me if it helps you relax. That seemed to break the tension, and Bones glared at him. I left instructions to not be interrupted, Potter. Harry shrugged unrepentantly. Oops. I didn't know you left instructions. The woman held her head and murmured, Bloody teenagers, before turning back towards the older wizard. We'll be in touch in case I have any further questions. You've already given me enough to deal with. I'll leave you two be. After all, you barely have a few days together. Who am I to deprive you of them? The Black Patriarch gave her a questioning look, which caused her to smile smugly. You didn't hear. I suppose we haven't announced it yet. McGonagall is finally opening Hogwarts back up. You should be back in school next week. And just like that, she left, her auras following her. Deciding to file that piece of information for later, he turned towards his ward. So, what have you been up to? I assume you spent some time hunting wolves. Harry snorted in amusement and chuckled. Oh, you have no idea. Let's just say that the last few were eventful. When the boy started telling him about what happened, Arcturus realized that this was probably the understatement of the century. 410, Chapter 410, Opened Borders. 18th May 1995, Hogwarts, Scotland. Harry snorted in amusement and chuckled. Oh, you have no idea. Let's just say that the last few were eventful. When the boy started telling him about what happened, Arcturus realized that this was probably the understatement of the century. Harry smiled faintly as the Hogwarts Express slowed down. He watched as the Forbidden Forest passed by him, seeing the odd magical creature running around in the background. It was a nice touch from McGonagall to get the enchanted train to return to London, thankfully not in its dragon form, for the schools are opening. It was weird. He was seated with the rest of the Hogwarts champions, at least not the ones who returned home, without them realizing that he was among them during the previous task. They were obviously wary of him. Harry didn't exactly blame them. They hadn't spoken to him since the third task, and even then he showed himself to be a bit beyond them in terms of magical prowess. They had gotten used to him previously, but his absence obviously made whatever casualness between them disappear. It was almost by the time they arrived that Roger Davies finally asked him, I can't believe you're still alive, Potter. The Ravenclaw was probably the one who spent the least amount of time with him out of everyone in the delegation. He wasn't just talking about the tournament, but the entirety of his time in Hogwarts as well. He just never cared enough to speak with the older boy. He had an air of superiority to him that made Harry want to avoid him, which was why it was flabbergasting that he'd be the one to speak up. And to make things worse, the way he spoke was a mixture of looking down at Harry while being obviously intimidated, just grating the young wizard the young way. He really didn't like fake people. Harry simply shrugged. And yet I am. Lucien Bowl seemed to gather the courage to speak up. Do you really expect us to believe that you were sick? I don't expect anything. People will make their assumptions, so why should I care what they think? They were all struck silent by the response, with Angelina obviously doing her best not to snicker at his responses, and he knew that Daphne was smiling as well, given the very slight upward tilt of her lips. His response seemed to have made them all feel awkward, and Davies decided to change the conversation. So, did anyone hear from Carmichael recently? I didn't see him on the train. They all shook heads, and the boy turned towards Daphne. What about you, Greengrass? You were very friendly with him during the task. Was he trying to make Harry mad at Daphne? Considering the way Roger was looking at him, searching for a reaction, expecting him to blow up or something, he was. Everyone else was too. The blonde must have understood what they were getting at because she gave everyone an unimpressed look. I haven't talked to him since we got back to Britain. But he did mention something about taking his Aurbile LS and moving abroad with his siblings. Apparently, he thought that staying in Britain was risky. I don't know when he'll be back, or if he ever will. The way everyone deflated was funny, especially given his lack of reaction. The young wizard rolled his eyes. They expected him to be jealous of himself. Then again, teenagers always liked gossip. He simply ignored them, looking at the familiar view. He had missed this place, missed the mysteries that were in every corner of the castle. He missed the room of requirements, hell, even the chamber of secrets. Speaking of the chamber, he needed to visit it soon for a personal project of his. But most of all, Harry felt his age whenever he stepped through the castle. Harry spent the last few days working with Arcturus about their forces, and that was far more draining than he expected. Unfortunately, it wasn't without a pretty lengthy discussion about Harry's shenanigans during his coma. To be fair to him, he was asleep for less than 2 weeks, and in that time, Harry fought Dumbledore, won the allegiance of his wand, performed an impromptu ritual in Stonehenge, removed the Horcrux in Longbottom's scar, found Voldemort and the first vampire to ever exist, broke into Azkaban, banished an eldritch being who threatened to consume the world, fought against the Dementor's creators, spoke to Solomon, and killed Voldemort. Now that he put it in a list, it did sound insane for what was essentially 10 days. No wonder Arcturus looked like he was losing his mind as Harry kept recounting his feats. In a way, Harry ended the Civil War in magical Britain. Both Voldemort and Lily were dead, their forces were either killed or under Harry's control. There were upsides and downsides, of course. It was a shame that Voldemort wouldn't be on their side. Mages of his caliber were rare, but they still probably held one of the biggest armies in Europe, and no one even knew. The Black Patriarch had been surprised by the fact that Harry had essentially taken over the Lycans after his fight with Dumbledore, as well as an alliance with the Department of Mysteries, with Snape being in charge. Arcturus himself had hired a small army of mercenaries, whose training he oversaw personally, and had gotten his old guard to essentially raise one of their own under his supervision. Italy and France had agreed pretty easily. Unfortunately, Scandinavian countries were hesitant to train a military force in their country, which was understandable. However, Arcturus's contact in Russia was able to hire mercenaries of his own, mostly from Eastern Europe. Harry was planning on talking to Perseus about involving the Greeks when he came. His father had shown that he didn't like what the Light and Dark were planning and was bound to be a very valuable ally. The foreign delegations should come in a couple of weeks, so he'll deal with that then. His train of thought was broken by the announcement of their arrival. Everyone stood up, a little giddily. It seemed that Harry wasn't the only one to miss the castle. Then again, they had friends and family members that they hadn't seen in months because of McGonagall closing down the wards. Minutes later, they all found themselves riding the Thestral carriages. There was something disconcerting in the fact that practically everyone could see the creatures. It took a year for all of them to witness death. And that was heartbreaking. They were all told that the tournament was safe and that there would be no real danger to the students. And yet, it was all a lie. Everyone witnessed Olympus being destroyed and watched people die in front of them, even without participating in the task. No one liked to talk about it, but it was obvious that whatever broadcasting method had shown a few champions' deaths, not that Harry blamed them for not saying anything. Cedric Diggory's death was a bit of a taboo subject. It was there, an overwhelming presence, like a dark cloud above them that everyone wanted to ignore. Not all of them liked the boy or his attitude, but he was one of them. The worst part is not knowing, really. They didn't find a corpse. He wasn't being recorded after he entered the labyrinth. All in all, his death lacked the closure they needed. But the oddest thing was the sheer relief that the others were feeling at returning to Hogwarts. They wouldn't compete in the tournament anymore. Even without the unforeseen dangers, Harry had underestimated how much pressure they were all under. They were far away from home, with very minimal support while representing their country. It was understandable that they craved a familiar place without any pressure to publicly succeed in some arbitrary tasks. Honestly, it didn't help that Britain was in complete chaos during most of the tournament. Harry couldn't really blame them for wanting the experience to end. Before he knew it, the last Potter found himself walking up the stairs to the Great Hall. He'd been walking on autopilot ever since he exited the train. Slowly, the gigantic doors opened, and he winced at the noise. Applause. For the first time in a while, every single student was up and clapping, no matter their house. It was oddly gratifying to see the school united at a single time. As he made his way to the top of the hall, he caught a glimpse of familiar faces, some giving him nods of approval, others grinning, and even a few who weren't trying to hide their curiosity. While looking at the Gryffindor table, Harry's eyes met Neville's own, and he saw him clapping enthusiastically with the rest. Now that he thought about it, with the prophecy being broken, the boy was nothing more than a normal boy. He wasn't the chosen one, he wasn't some savior or the boy who lived. He was just a boy who lived through an attack over a decade ago, while also losing his parents. He was free. No Horcruxes, no Voldemort, no prophecy. Harry envied him for it immensely, but he did owe the boy that much at the very least. He recognized that he was a bit childish with how he dealt with him during his first couple of years in Hogwarts. It took a lot of self-reflection to understand that he'd been afraid of being caught in the tangles of the Chosen One at first. Enough that he antagonized the boy whenever he had the chance. To be fair, Neville was a massively spoiled and entitled brat at the time, so he didn't make it hard. He couldn't help but chuckle bitterly at the irony of Neville being free of his prophecy while he was stuck with one of his own. Now that he thought about it, he couldn't help but wonder if Dumbledore knew somehow that the prophecy was broken. Magical anomalies near Azkaban would not be completely unusual given that the place was starved of magic for centuries, and if someone investigated it, they wouldn't find any sign of Voldemort or a broken prophecy. Harry didn't know, and that meant that he'd need to consider both scenarios and plan around them. Still, the task was in a month, and he had enough time to plan. His eyes met Hermione's for a fraction of a second, and he definitely didn't like the calculating gleam in her eyes. He hadn't thought much about her since the World Cup. She was his mother's pawn, an asset of the Department of Mysteries, but with Lily dead, it was all up in the air. Personally, Harry thought that Lily had tried to help the girl in her own twisted way. As far as he knew, she essentially ordered her to spend time with Neville, and that was it. She didn't receive any orders or missions, not like Lily did at her age. Harry didn't know the specifics, but it sounded pretty horrific. He would talk to Snape about it later. There was some worry about the girl trying to get revenge, of course. He'll need to plan things properly later. Harry was about to sit down at the Slytherin table, only to be enveloped by a hug from Blaise. He looked towards Daphne, only to see her suffer the same fate as Tracy. "We missed you guys so much." Harry grinned. "We missed you too." Tracy quickly punched him in the shoulder. "That's for faking your death, you absolute idiot." Harry was about to reply, only for the entire Great Hall to quiet down, probably a charm from McGonagall. The headmistress stood up and answered, "I am very happy to welcome back our delegation into our halls once more. You made us all proud with your achievements and your courage, even during uncertain times. I am also glad to say that the war wards on the castle have officially been lifted and that you will all, even the younger years, be allowed to visit Hogsmeade this weekend, so make arrangements with your families accordingly. You can use the school owls or one of your own to contact them, either in the magical or muggle world. The entire school erupted in cheers, even the normally reserved Slytherins. Harry didn't know how much the isolation affected the student morale while he was gone, but it must have been significant. McGonagall raised her hands, and the hall quieted once more. However, as much as this is a happy occasion, it's not without its tragedies. I know that most of you know about the fate of Cedric Diggory, who died bravely in the 6th task of the tournament. He was a young man with a very promising future. He was brave, clever, and very kind, and the world is that much darker without him. We will never forget him. Cedric Diggory had a future that was full of promise, a future that has now been stolen. We will honor him the way he deserves, with remembrance, with love, and with gratitude for the time he was given among us. She raised her goblet, her eyes unwavering, filled with both mourning and fierce resolve. We will hold a public memorial here at Hogwarts to ensure that his name is never forgotten. And now let us raise our glasses to Cedric Diggory. The hall stood in unison, the somber echo of the words settling over them all. To Cedric Diggory! Harry raised his goblet as well, remembering the boy that he had failed, that he had let be manipulated by Dumbledore into committing an atrocity. Never again. That was what Harry was fighting for. That was why he was willing to fight Dumbledore and Grindelwald. It was why he had to win. Still, somber atmosphere aside, Harry was glad to be back, even if he had a lot to do and a lot to prepare.